You're listening to episode 257 of Mitolife Radio. I'm Matt Blackburn, your host, and today I'm interviewing Calvin Scheller. Calvin is a fellow researcher like myself, and we actually have a very similar background. He started with listening to a ton of podcasts with a critical mind, really questioning the information that was being shared, even from very influential authority figures in the health community. And when he had had enough, he started to read more scientific studies and analyze them. And he became intrigued because of his own personal health issues with the whole topic of insulin resistance. So in this show, Calvin provides kind of a crash course on this topic of insulin and the common story that you hear that you eat carbs increase insulin, more insulin you produce, the more insulin resistant you become. And therefore, if you stop eating carbs altogether, you can't be insulin resistant. So Calvin challenges that narrative that often comes from the carnivore keto community and kind of defends fruits and vegetables and fiber and talks about this whole topic with more of a holistic perspective. So this show gets pretty technical and he gets really into the weeds with the biochemistry of everything. But if you or someone you love is overweight or healing from a diabetic condition, I think this information is really important. And of course, nothing on the show is ever medical advice. There's a ton of information out there about weight loss and diabetes and blood sugar, but it's really obscured with marketing, people marketing their programs, their books, their supplements, whatever it is, to share a certain narrative. And oftentimes that's a carnivore keto narrative, or it's the reverse, that people absolutely need carbohydrates to heal. And I like Calvin's approach because it can go either way. He's not against very low carb diets, especially short term, and he's not against eating carbohydrates either. So in this episode, Calvin talks about his story dealing with an autoimmune condition and being prescribed thyroid medication and injections of testosterone. Then his experience delving into the keto, carnivore, low carb diet arena, how he became intrigued with insulin resistance. And then Calvin starts breaking down what insulin resistance is, what insulin sensitivity is, the effects of sleep deprivation on our blood glucose, the effects of being sedentary on insulin resistance, why he likes the oral glucose tolerance test versus blood glucose monitors, the health benefits of insulin and why it's not just a fat storing hormone, how a high fat diet increases insulin resistance, why saturated fats contribute to physiological insulin resistance more than omega-3s and omega-6s, the effects of fasting on insulin resistance, how micronutrient deficiencies play a role. I ask him his thoughts on ketones and measuring ketones. He talks about the health benefits of having transient gas and bloating after eating fiber, why he believes maintaining healthy body weight and exercising regularly are the keys to regulating insulin and blood glucose levels, why grazing on protein throughout the day might not be a good thing. Talks about leptin and leptin resistance, talk about circadian rhythms. And then at the end, I ask him listener questions, including what are the best supplements for lowering blood sugar, how to lower blood sugar that's always around 100, thoughts on different probiotic strains to reverse insulin resistance, thoughts on pediatric glycogen storage disorder and ketotic hypoglycemia, his thoughts on Ozempic, what are the main causes of gestational diabetes, what is the truth about sugar consumption and how do sweeteners influence blood sugar, what's the connection between insulin and polycystic ovarian syndrome? What are the best approaches to improve non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? Will eating fruit on its own spike blood sugar differently than when you eat it after a meal with fats and proteins? This episode was definitely pedal to the metal with this information. So take notes if you have to. Take what you can practically apply to your life to improve your life or others around you. As I said, there is a obesity epidemic. People are overweight. They're dealing with blood sugar dysregulation. And the common solutions that we get from the alternative health community, I think, is subpar. So it's my wish that this interview with Calvin helps to improve a lot of lives. So enjoy. Here is Calvin Scheller. All right, Calvin Scheller, welcome to the show.
Dude, I'm so excited.
Yeah, before we hit record, you were saying that you've been listening to my podcast for years.
Yeah, so I think I'd say about 2 years ago, I came across. I'm sure it was one of the Morley Robbins interviews, and I started listening to it, and I was fascinated. So like I thought he was super in depth. I thought your questions were great. So I started listening to that one, and at the time, I was listening to a lot of podcasts. Let's go with that. And so I just came over to your page, and I just started kind of binge listening to all your podcasts. And luckily, I worked a job where I was landscaping, so I could essentially have my headphones in 8-9 hours a day. And that whole time I was listening to podcasts. I've never been much of a music guy, so I was just listening to podcasts almost endlessly. So it's kind of, it's hard to describe how much content I've gone through in the past few years. So as you were a little bit surprised, I'm only 18 right now. But this all started about 4-ish years ago, I'd say, my journey kind of into nutrition and human physiology. And at the time, that was right when lockdown happened. So, as you might expect, I'm just a kid. I've got nothing to do and nowhere to go. So my entire day was kind of consumed with, I'd go outside because I was allowed to do that, but I couldn't go anywhere anyway. So I was kind of just outside all day long. I played baseball a little bit, so I just had my headphones in, maybe hitting the tee a little bit, just going on walks, anything I can do. But I was probably listening to podcasts for 8 or 9 hours a day for a solid 2 or 3 years, I'd say, between the realm of, with school. And then, I've always been one to do my work real quickly in school. So I would kind of do my work and then throw the headphones in and just kind of consume content that way. I really liked it that way. Over the past about 2 years, I'd say that I've learned that not every podcast is factual, which was, interesting to me. I thought at that time, I'm sure I thought you couldn't publish stuff that wasn't factual, but that's not true. So the past 2-ish years, my education style has changed a lot, more towards actually reading a lot of the scientific articles. So nowadays, I don't really listen to much podcasts. I've got a lot of podcasts that I want to listen to, but most of my research is done kind of reading different journal articles and things like that. And that's where I've kind of gotten a lot of the information for some of my videos. I've heard things online that weren't quite true, but at the time I believed them. And then I started reading and realized that they were a little bit off from what is actually true, or what the people that are really studying the topics believe. So that kind of sparked my desire to make some of these videos, kind of showing what the science actually says versus some of the mainstream narratives. Hopefully we'll get into that a little bit today.
Yeah, that's what caught my attention with your stuff, was your reels where you were kind of calling out these podcasters or health educators or influencers that were sharing information that was not accurate. And that's something I'd like to explore with you too. Like, is it possible that like you, I think we had a similar journey. I was spending 8-9 hours a day, maybe 10 hours a day. I don't know, years ago, listening to podcasts while working. And I learned a lot of information, and I was just accumulating. And at some point I'm like, oh, I should probably share this because I'm putting it together in a really interesting way. But later I find out that a lot of that stuff was kind of based on false premises. So it's kind of like, built on, not on steady ground. They're fundamental principles. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, reading scientific studies, I really commend you on that, because that's it's like another language in itself. I mean, I have PhD friends that I talk with, and they're breaking down different articles that I'm sending them. And they're like, yeah, but they conducted it this way, so it's not really valid. They messed up this. And it's an art, really, to analyze those studies, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, at the beginning, I'd say it took me, multiple hours to get through one study, just because even the most basic ones, because most of the words I was almost unfamiliar with, it sounded like a different language. And then, kind of learning a little bit more of what things are, you can almost kind of skip through certain portions of studies sometimes because you already know the background. And then other things is, yeah, like some studies are designed in a way to show something, but people misinterpret it. Recently I actually did a reel on, there was a guy saying that fasting would increase your testosterone, and he used a study from, I think, 1989. And when you go back in the study, while these participants were fasting, they were also being injected with gonadotropin releasing hormone. So under normal conditions, your testosterone would almost tank during fasting. But because these participants were quite literally almost on testosterone injections, their testosterone levels did rise, and they were more sensitive to the gonadotropin releasing hormone when they were in the fasted state. But because your natural production goes down, it doesn't really matter how much more sensitive you are. So you would see normally a decrease in testosterone. But if you didn't read the study and you just read the abstract, you would say, hey, fasting increases testosterone. And then people go on the internet and say these kind of stuff. So even if you are reading some of the research, it's still difficult to, fully ascertain everything that's going on in the article and what can be extrapolated from articles and what can't be. A lot of times people apply, think, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And a lot of times this isn't really the case. And it's awesome. Like a lot of articles, a lot of authors at the end, they're like, here's what we think this does say, and here's what it doesn't say. And here's things that, we need more study. Almost every article ends with, we need more studies on the topic. But a lot of articles are like, we can't prove this, but this is an indication of something. But a lot of people make that logical leap. And then other people on the internet, and I was one of them at the beginning, because again, I was young, impressionable, things like that. I don't think I actually opened a textbook or, started reading anything till I was about a year in the journey. And when I started reading things, I was, there were time and time again, I was like, oh, well, this was wrong and this was wrong. And it was things that I heard on the internet. And I thought it was true because I thought everything on the internet had to be true. So I do think, kind of moving your education, while your podcast, I would say everything that I hear on your podcast, almost, I look up, I'm like, hey, I'm super glad it's true. But then on other people's podcasts, that's another thing, is learning which podcasts, are credible and which ones aren't. So, as time goes on, you learn to refine the sources that you use for information, and you get better and better at finding the truth, essentially. And I think I've gotten really good at that just because I've spent a lot of time on that over about 4 years. And I started when I was young, so I almost developed this mindset even at a really young age, which is nice for today. So, I don't have the best memory. I'll say that. I go 3 places in town, and anywhere else I need a GPS for, because I can't remember anything. So a lot of times, even on subjects that I'm interested in, I still have to go back and read research a lot of times, just because I don't have this, perfect memory that a lot of people have. So the more and more I get to research, the more and more I can kind of become more efficient at reading research and kind of getting the truth, getting to the bottom of things, I guess.
That's awesome. Yeah, I guess that fortunately passed, but the creator of the Magnetico sleep pad, Dean Bonley, he was saying in a lecture off my podcast, just on YouTube, I remember him saying he had photographic memory, and he lost that when he got mercury amalgam dental fillings. And then when he started to chelate the mercury with I forget what it was, DMSA, DMPS, all the hardcore chelators plus magnetism, his photographic memory came back. That was always intriguing to me, because I'm always envious of people that have that ability. And I doubt it's just one factor, right? It can't just be just mercury, but I'm sure it could play a huge role in some people.
Yeah, I really wish I had, photographic memory. It'd make things a lot easier. But I guess I've always had, I guess the best way to describe it is kind of like an obsessive personality. So I get really into things and, I go all in, and luckily I've been able to divert that towards, nutrition and physiology. But because I don't have, it's almost like what I make or what I lack in, memory skills and kind of like inborn intelligence. I do my best to make up with just putting in as many hours as possible.
I think you're doing great. Uh, Before we jump into the topic, have you heard, like I have people I've interviewed that, or just I hear in the health space that they don't put a lot of credence into scientific studies. I mean, a lot of people have this mentality, right? And that um, uh, individual genetics, that just kind of negates all studies because everybody's so different with their, SNPs and their mutations. Or, the quantum people say EMFs and blue light influence study results because all the rodents are always under that wavelength, which actually like raises blood glucose and has all these physiological effects. Have you heard that stuff going around? Or
Yeah, I've definitely heard that. We're not allowed to use any of the scientific studies because of the blue light. Unfortunately, we all end up, there's only maybe, 0.001% of the population that isn't constantly under blue light. So at some point you would kind of be able to extrapolate it to the majority of the population. And I do think that genetics are massive. But there are certain basic characteristics and basic things that once you get down, that's when you can get really deep into the genetics. And in most of my videos, if there is a caveat that needs to be said, like you may have different genetics than this. And a lot of times I do mention genetics, like there are genetics for the absorption of dietary cholesterol from your food, things like that. And a lot of times I like to mention those things to say that, yes, people are different, but there are basic things that, almost every human and every living organism has in common. There are things that trace back thousands of years to even the smallest organisms. And understanding those things helps you learn and helps you kind of understand the different genetic propensities. So maybe in the topic we'll get to talk about today, I'll tell you about some people are genetically predisposed to having insulin resistance. And in these people, the basic underlying mechanisms still apply, but they just have, abnormalities in how active or underactive these mechanisms are. But when you learn the basics, you can understand why it actually makes sense. So yes, I think everyone is different. And I do love what a lot of people are doing with, personalized supplementation based off of genetics. But I do think there still is an underlying physiology that, underpins everything. So understanding that can help you cater to each individual.
That's awesome. Yeah, I like that approach. So our topic is insulin resistance. And I think you were starting to tell me before we recorded why you got into that topic. I think you mentioned you were underweight. Is that what you're starting to say? Or
Yeah, so I had three big things, I'd say, when I was about 14 that all surmounted into me being extremely underweight. So the first one was I was convinced, a young impressionable kid, I was convinced that a vegetarian diet, that was the way to go. And it wasn't, I wasn't thinking about protein, micronutrients. I was just thinking about, just eat as many vegetables as possible. And then the next thing I was introduced to is something called the snake diet, where essentially you go long periods of time without eating, eat one big large meal, and then go another long period of time without eating. So mixing those two together, I was overweight at the time, and then I started losing a lot of weight. And I didn't get underweight yet. I was losing a lot of muscle, obviously, which impaired my performance in baseball, which I loved, and probably led to the injury that eventually kind of pulled me away from baseball. But then the straw that really broke the camel's back was I had somewhat of an autoimmune attack towards my intestinal tract that leaves me today with a lot of food intolerances and a lot of malabsorption issues. So even still today, I'm kind of suffering from this. But at the time, it got to the point where, I was throwing up a lot. I was unable to absorb a lot of the food that I was eating. So, and I wasn't hungry because, there was so much going on that I almost had this sickness response kind of thing. So I was probably eating 1,000 calories a day. And again, it was just, vegetables because I was still in the vegetarian sphere. And I lost a lot of weight. I ended up getting down to about 107 pounds, but I was also 5'8". So it was fairly low, and I still say today I'm kind of lucky to be alive. So I'm, blessed for that. And when I went to the doctor, they did do some blood work. So I had two interesting results. The first was, as you might expect from kind of starvation, if that makes any sense. I had really low thyroid, because we know thyroid downregulates when you're not really eating much. So the doctor prescribed me thyroid medication and sent me on my way. Didn't ask anything about nutrition. And then I came back again. I was telling the doctor I really thought I had issues with my testosterone. Obviously, I was still doing all the terrible stuff with nutrition, but I thought maybe a testosterone injection would help. So I actually got a testosterone test, and this tests are sensitive between 5 nanograms and 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. When I got my test back, the only thing it said was less than 5 nanograms per deciliter, essentially meaning my testosterone was undetectable. But again, the doctor gave me testosterone, biweekly injections, and sent me on my way and didn't ask anything about nutrition. So I started learning a little bit more while I was taking all this, and I realized I'm not going to fix any of this if I don't fix, the nutrition, my gastrointestinal disorders. But unfortunately, being an impressionable young kid, I went to the extreme, or the opposite extreme, essentially, and I went on a completely carnivore diet. I started learning a ton about ketogenic diets, low carb diets, carnivore diets. And while I do think they have some merit in some situations, and adding in a lot of nutritious animal foods is a fantastic start, but I don't think you need to be dogmatic about no carbohydrates, only animal products. Maybe adding in a bell pepper every once in a while won't hurt anybody. But I was hearing a lot of stuff about insulin resistance, especially from the low carb sphere. So that kind of inundated me with the idea, I guess the canonical view of insulin resistance in this sphere, which is essentially you eat carbohydrates, which increase your insulin. And the more insulin that you produce, the more insulin resistant you become. So the strategy would just be stop eating carbohydrates and you can't become insulin resistant. But when you actually read a lot of the literature, most of the literature indicates that a high carbohydrate, low fat diet improves insulin sensitivity, whereas an extremely high fat, low carbohydrate diet can cause what's referred to as physiologic insulin resistance. We might get into this, but if you actually give people, a bolus of carbohydrates and measure their insulin sensitivity, those eating a lot of carbohydrates who are constantly increasing their insulin will be more sensitive to insulin. So it kind of completely reverses the idea that, insulin I guess the theory can be best described as insulin-induced insulin resistance, which is essentially the more insulin you produce, the more insulin resistant you will become. And this does, it makes sense at its basis because, a lot of neurotransmitters and hormones are like this. The more dopamine that you produce, the less sensitive you become. The more GABA and glutamate you produce, the less sensitive you become. So there are a lot of physiological systems in the body that do run this way, but insulin isn't actually one of those. But, if you go into any of the, really low carbohydrate spheres, and again, there's nothing wrong with a low carbohydrate diet, as I promise I'll let everyone know that's my opinion at the end. I love low carbohydrate diets. They're great. But the idea that you must do low carbohydrate to prevent insulin resistance is kind of a flawed logic when you actually understand the mechanisms behind it, what makes it worse and what can actually make it better.
Yeah, that was a great introduction. And I think a lot of the focus goes to carbs for insulin resistance, but there's so many things that can affect it. Like today, I'm slightly underslept, had a super late night. And so it's my understanding that sleep deprivation causes some insulin resistance. Is that right? That's another factor.
I had a part in, what I wanted to talk about. So they've done studies where they put participants on 4 hours of sleep. And after day 10, they measure what's referred to as glucose tolerance. So this is essentially you take a set solution of glucose, like a glucose drink, almost like a Gatorade, and you drink it and you see how easily you are able to get this glucose into all of your cells and how much insulin it takes to get the glucose into your cells. So the more insulin it takes, that indicates that you're more insulin resistant. So, in like diabetics who are insulin resistant, they may have the same level of glucose as a lean, healthy person, but the amount of insulin they need to produce to maintain the same blood glucose is exponentially higher. So in people that are sleep deprived, their glucose tolerance is about 50% of what a normal person would be. And the reason for this is actually because sleep increases the production of inflammatory cytokines. And the most specific one in terms of insulin resistance is IL-6, so interleukin 6. And this can essentially bind to the same cell that insulin would bind to, but it inhibits insulin from sending the proper signal. Hopefully, maybe we can lay out the basics of the insulin signaling cascade and how this can be disrupted. But essentially, just remember for now, the production of these inflammatory cytokines can actually lead to cells becoming resistant to insulin. And because sleep deprivation leads to an increased production and decreased clearance of these inflammatory cytokines, your glucose tolerance or your insulin resistance essentially goes up drastically.
Wow. And that's just one factor, right? There's a whole bunch of like non-food factors besides carbs that can influence it, right?
There are so many factors: body weight, physical activity, environmental pollutants, micronutrient deficiencies, things like that. And I made a little post on Instagram that I got to tag you in, and essentially you get a tooth infection. The production of these inflammatory cytokines to mount that immune response during a tooth infection will transiently make someone insulin resistant. So there are so many things completely. You could be as healthy as possible. You could be active, fit, perfect glucose or insulin sensitivity, and you get sick and your insulin sensitivity will acutely go down drastically. And this isn't a pathological thing. This may actually be a good thing. So you think about it, the more resistant your cells are to insulin, the more glucose is available in your bloodstream. White blood cells also use glucose. So the more glucose you can spare for your white blood cells, the stronger your immune system can be and the more capable you would be to fight off some sort of infection or pathogen. So it makes sense. This would kind of be referred to as like a physiological insulin resistance or a beneficial thing. But there's also pathological versions that maybe we'll get to discuss as well.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw my post. I think it was like a year and a half ago. I neglected the dentist, like a lot of us that have been in these spaces that you mentioned. I was in the raw vegan thing, and it's like, you never need to go to the dentist. Meanwhile, their teeth are literally falling out. Or I've seen, carnivore people say, you don't need a toothbrush or you shouldn't use toothpaste. And I brush my teeth with fluoride toothpaste. I love it. Very helpful. But I was making the point that I had 4 cavities. This is before I did fluoride toothpaste. I want to make that emphasis. And I finally went and had them taken care of. Unfortunately, it wasn't deep enough to need a root canal. I just had fillings. And I did an inside tracker before and after. And it's only one marker, but it was a broad spectrum test. But the CRP, C-reactive protein, which is one of the main inflammatory markers, that went down significantly, like from like a 10 to like a 1 or something. So yeah, tooth infections are crazy. And, at the same time, I was using a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, which we might talk about. And my levels were like pre-diabetic. And I mean, they did improve over time. I don't know if that's because I went low carb or, at the same time I had the dental work done. But yeah, sometimes it's hard to tell when you're doing a bunch of stuff at once, like what was responsible for, improving your glucose regulation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things, and even like there's one thing like the majority of insulin resistance is driven by excess body fat, essentially. But there are things you can find lean people that are insulin resistant because they're extremely sedentary. Being sedentary is another thing that increases insulin resistance, and again, we'll hopefully explain why. So, maybe when you're sick, you're also more sedentary. You're not moving as much. So there's so many things that would coincide together that can increase insulin resistance. And this is almost like an underlying, like silent thing, because sometimes insulin resistance manifests as, high blood glucose because your pancreas is producing the same amount of insulin, but you're more insulin resistant. So less glucose is going into your cells. But sometimes insulin resistance manifests as having the exact same blood glucose, but at much higher levels of insulin. So sometimes, just wearing a CGM, you can't really tell how insulin sensitive you would be unless you were measuring your insulin. And, probably the best measurement would be an oral glucose tolerance test. So again, drinking that Gatorade-like solution and seeing how much insulin you need to get your glucose back down and how long it takes. So there's a lot of things that doing a low carb diet could essentially mask insulin resistance. If you're not consuming any carbohydrates, you would have no idea your glucose tolerance. And, if you became actually, as we'll discuss, when you become insulin resistant as a cause of a high fat diet, this is actually beneficial because insulin resistance spares glucose for your brain. So if you become insulin resistant at the level of the muscle and at the level of the liver, there's more glucose available for all of those cells that require it. So certain cells can't run on anything other than glucose. A lot of your brain is this way. Your red blood cells are this way. So when you decrease the uptake of glucose by the muscles, you're sparing this glucose for kind of glucose dependent cells. So now might even be a good time to get into what insulin is and how all this happens.
Let's do it. Yeah. And real quick before we do, I'm here in Idaho and with real winters, and I've heard with hibernating animals, they do create that seasonal insulin resistance when they go into hibernation. And it's a good thing, like grizzly bears or black bears or ground squirrels or whatever. So that kind of makes sense that they're kind of preserving their glucose to get through the winter, right?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if it's the same word for grizzly bears, but I think it's referred to as something called torpor, where you essentially go into hibernation. And yeah, when you're completely at rest, most of your metabolism can be run off of fatty acids when you're kind of just sitting there. So because you have, only a few hundred grams of glucose stored on your body, but you have hundreds of thousands of calories, in the case of a bear, probably even more than that, stored on your body. If you're running essentially every physiological function that can run off of fat, you'll run that off of fat. So you can spare the little glucose that is available that's stored inside of your liver, and that you can create through a process called gluconeogenesis. All of that is essentially spared for your brain and, every tissue that requires glucose. So it's kind of a beneficial adaptation. And the same thing occurs when you're not eating carbohydrates. You need to spare this little glucose in your bloodstream for, the tissues that need it.
Right. Well, yeah, let's jump in on, you've been describing quite a bit about insulin, but you mentioned the insulin signaling cascade, how it's disrupted. And if you could just lay it out like in the most simplistic way, if you're like describing it to someone, at a coffee shop or elevator or something, that would be appreciated.
All right. So essentially, insulin is typically increased after the consumption of food, so specifically glucose. So glucose can flow into the pancreas, and the pancreas is the organ that can release insulin. So the pancreas almost always has a monitor on your blood glucose levels. And when glucose levels increase above what is like physiologically normal blood glucose, around like 75 to 90, the pancreas will release insulin. And one of insulin's jobs is to essentially shuttle fuel out of the bloodstream into all of our cells, because glucose in the bloodstream, when it's elevated, can actually become kind of toxic at some point. It's kind of glucose toxicity. And that's why diabetics who always have fairly high glucose have a lot of cardiovascular issues, what's called micro and macrovascular issues. So essentially extremely impaired blood vessels and a lot of other complications that go alongside the high blood glucose that manifests as a result of insulin resistance. So insulin has a lot of functions. So kind of people describe it as the fat storing hormone, but it does a heck of a lot more than that. So I guess we can talk about insulin signaling first. So insulin will bind to the insulin receptor, and this receptor is located in the brain, the pancreas, the liver, the skeletal muscle, and the adipose tissue, and some other places as well. And when it binds to its receptor, insulin never enters the cell. It just triggers a series of events that occur inside of the cell and kind of the activation of different proteins found inside of your cells that carry out the insulin signaling. So the insulin receptor is considered a transmembrane receptor. So it has a portion on the outside and a portion on the inside. And there's a portion that kind of spans through the membrane of a cell and can interact with the innards of the cell. So insulin will bind to its receptor. And I guess there's a few proteins involved in the insulin signal, but I think the main one to remember is that when insulin binds to its receptor, this leads to the binding of insulin response substrate, or IRS. And this will bind to the inside portion of the insulin receptor. And then directly after this, another protein called PI3 kinase will bind to IRS. So this is kind of the big protein complex you need to remember. It's IRS and then PI3K. And this stimulates a lot of other proteins inside of the cell. There we go. That's perfect. So essentially, PI3K will do something called phosphorylation. So phosphates are just these little molecules inside of the cell that when you add them to other proteins, these little proteins can become more or less activated. So it's essentially the energy that can either activate or inactivate certain proteins. So when this PI3 kinase is activated, it will go phosphorylate another protein. And there's a few proteins inside of this process, but the main thing that happens is the activation of a protein called AKT. And what AKT can do is a lot, actually. So it can essentially activate a lot of intracellular proteins that do a bunch of different things inside of the cell. So the main functions are going to be to allow glucose to enter the bloodstream into the cell. Another thing AKT will do is inhibit glycogenolysis, or the breakdown of muscle glycogen. And it will increase glycogen synthesis. So we uptake more glucose out of the bloodstream and we synthesize more glycogen. So we store glucose inside of the cell. We will also inhibit the release of fatty acids from our fat tissue because, when we have high blood glucose, we don't need to release more into the bloodstream. Mm-hmm. And then we will increase what's called lipogenesis, or the creation of lipids that are stored inside of our fat cells. There's a few other things that most people don't realize that insulin actually does. So inside of the brain, insulin can increase the formation of neurons and synapses. It can also increase the production of different hormones responsible for suppressing our appetite. These include leptin, neuropeptide Y, and POMC, things like that. It can also actually act on the kidneys to increase the reabsorption of sodium. So a lot of people who are on ketogenic diets actually suffer with a lot of sodium loss inside of their urine because insulin will bind to a receptor on the kidneys and stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb sodium out of the bladder into the bloodstream. So when you lose this in the sense of insulin resistance or on a very low carbohydrate, low insulin diet, you may need more sodium. The other thing insulin can do is inside of the muscles can stimulate protein synthesis. So it increases the uptake of amino acids and it increases the synthesis of amino acids. It also decreases protein breakdown. It has other effects like it can increase steroidogenesis, the production of testosterone and estrogen and things like that. And it decreases a binding protein inside of our bloodstream called SHBG. So as I'm kind of describing these things, you can see that insulin does a lot. It can even activate our immune system. So it strengthens our immune system. So it does a lot throughout the body. So the kind of narrow focus on insulin is the fat storing hormone that many people focus on is really short-sighted in a lot of senses.
Yeah, as you're saying all this, like I picture Dr. Berg, one of those YouTube, health educators, and I listened to him years ago. He's kind of entertaining. I think Scientologist guy, but it's funny because all his videos on insulin, it's like the devil, like it's just a bad thing that has no benefits is how he kind of frames it in his, every video. It's really interesting because there you were going through all the benefits of insulin, right?
So it does essentially increase the storage of nutrients. That's true. But it also does a lot of other things that are really important. So it's essentially the best way to think about insulin is the anti-catabolic hormone. So it prevents you from breaking down what you already have on your body. And it can also be slightly anabolic depending on the signal. So if insulin is raised alongside a lot of nutrients in the bloodstream, it can build fat tissue, it can build glycogen, it can build proteins. So there are mechanisms by which insulin will increase the storage of, fat and glucose and protein, but you can store as much fat as you want without any insulin. If you ate a very high fat diet, there are mechanisms completely independent of insulin that these fatty acids can be stored. So, at the end of the day, it does, as most people don't want to hear it, come back to whether or not you're in energy balance. So if you're consuming more than you're expending, a lot of things can affect how much you expend. So it's not, and a lot of the things that you eat can affect how much you expend. So it's not a narrow focus on, calories in, calories out necessarily, but at the end of the day, energy balance is key. But I guess the big thing is that lack of insulin signaling is also detrimental. People who are on ketogenic diets for long periods of time, a lot of times they have, again, a reduced tolerance to glucose, as we'll talk about, but they also can suffer with a lot of, almost a decreased ability to put on muscle mass sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. They also suffer with a lot of electrolyte issues because of insulin's role in the kidneys. So I think spiking insulin or raising, I hate the word spiking sometimes, but raising insulin at the right times can be beneficial for a lot of contexts and a lot of people. So I think always trying to lower insulin isn't necessarily doing anyone a big service unless they already have underlying insulin resistance.
So in raising insulin at the right time, like I've heard, is it after a workout, because your muscles will kind of soak up the glucose easier? Is that one case?
So essentially, to drive glucose into your muscles, you do need some sort of insulin, signaling. Usually, there are insulin-independent ways to get glucose into the muscles. So the way that insulin actually gets glucose into your muscles is by what's called GLUT4 translocation. So this is essentially a small transport protein that sits inside of your cells. Typically, like when you're not doing anything and there's no stimulation, it sits inside of your cells. So glucose won't enter into your muscles at a very high rate. And this spares glucose, again, for the brain and tissues that need it when you don't have much glucose. But when insulin is raised, this causes what's called translocation of the GLUT4 receptor. So essentially, this little protein will bind to the membrane of the cell, and it can essentially act like a funnel to allow glucose from the bloodstream into our cells. So you can also exercise to translocate this GLUT4. So it's called contraction-stimulated GLUT4 translocation. That's just a fancy way of saying when you're moving your muscles will uptake more and more glucose. So that's why going after a walk after a meal can actually be super helpful because it can increase the amount of glucose that gets inside of your muscles. But, most of the glucose that enters into our muscles is driven into the muscles by insulin's ability to increase the muscle's uptake of glucose. So you don't necessarily need insulin, but it's a lot more convenient and a lot more helpful than trying to do it in the absence of any insulin spike. So eating a low carbohydrate diet.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things to see when I was wearing the continuous glucose monitor, was taking a walk after breakfast and seeing, doing that, not doing it, and the difference in my blood glucose that it makes. It was dramatic. And that was just like a 5 or 10-minute walk. Like it doesn't take much. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I mean, it can also resynthesizing glycogen doesn't necessarily need to be immediately after an exercise session, but the faster you can do it, the more energy your muscles will have. So sometimes, eating something high glycemic after a workout, meaning something that will increase your blood glucose quite rapidly, can be beneficial because it can almost start the recovery process a little bit earlier. But I guess one of the big things to touch on is kind of the typical view of insulin resistance. Again, being that insulin resistance is driven by, excessive carbohydrate consumption. And there's actually a lot of things that increase insulin resistance, but the mechanism behind insulin resistance is actually entirely fatty acid dependent. So that's kind of an interesting thing for a lot of people to hear. So essentially inside of our cells, you remember the thing that started the insulin signaling cascade was IRS binds to the insulin response or the insulin receptor, and then PI3K will bind. So inside of our cells, sometimes there are little molecules called diacylglycerols and free fatty acids. And these free fatty acids and diacylglycerols can actually bind to the IRS protein itself and inhibit PI3K from binding and properly sending through the entire insulin signaling. So the problem that underlies insulin resistance has nothing really to do with carbohydrate consumption and more to do with the availability of fat inside of our liver and inside of our muscles mainly. And there's a lot of things that can increase the amount of fat that's available, one of which, probably the most important, being obesity. So when we are larger, interestingly, as most people may not think about it, people that are overweight have increased lipolysis, or the release of fatty acids inside of their bloodstream and inside of their cells. The reason for this is actually because the fat cell has gotten so large that the proteins that should be kind of safeguarding the lipid droplet inside of our fat cells, they're not able to cover enough surface area to prevent these fat cells from being catabolized. So people that are larger have increased lipolysis, an increased amount of diacylglycerols and free fatty acids inside of their cells. So this is how obesity itself will lead to insulin resistance. Other things that can lead to this, if you're not exercising, you may be releasing fatty acids or even uptaking fatty acids at the muscle and at the liver. But if you're not utilizing these fatty acids through exercise, they can sit inside of the cell and then bind to the insulin protein. Unfortunately, as a lot of people don't want to hear, the consumption of an extremely high fat meal alongside carbohydrates can decrease your insulin sensitivity and increase blood glucose quite drastically. So because acutely the consumption of fat can increase insulin resistance because it increases the amount of these fatty acids inside of the cells, it does appear that eating a very high fat diet will decrease your glucose tolerance.
So you mentioned like a high fat diet inducing insulin resistance. Can you go into that for a little bit?
Yeah, so essentially when you're eating a very high fat, low carbohydrate diet, so when you have low glucose inside of your bloodstream, your cells can actually become insulin resistant acutely. It's called physiologic insulin resistance. And the main cells that become insulin resistant are the muscles and the liver. So they'll essentially stop uptaking glucose to spare the glucose for glucose dependent cells. So, the immune cells, the red blood cells, and the brain, because these tissues essentially require glucose. They can't use fatty acids for energy. And it's interesting, as unfortunate as it may sound for some people, saturated fats actually do this to a greater degree than polyunsaturated fats or monounsaturated fats, even the omega-6s. But I think the reason behind this is actually because if you look into it, the body will actually burn polyunsaturated fats at 2 or 3 times the rate that it burns saturated fats. This may be because, polyunsaturated fats are more unstable. So the body is much less likely to store polyunsaturated fats, and it's much quicker to burn them off and store the saturated fats. When you let's say you give a glucose solution, and then you give it mixed in with 3 different types of fats. So a polyunsaturated fat, a monounsaturated fat, and a saturated fat. Insulin resistance, so your glucose tolerance, is decreased the most when consuming it alongside a saturated fat, drink. And again, this is because these saturated fats are much less likely to be burned or oxidized. So they can begin accumulating or being converted into free fatty acids and diacylglycerols, which can again inhibit the insulin receptor. So it's almost like when the ingestion of fat and calories in general increases or surpasses the amount that you're oxidizing, you can become acutely insulin resistant because there's essentially fatty acids that sit inside of our cells that aren't being burned or stored, and they're kind of just inhibiting the insulin receptor a little bit. And now again, the biggest driver of this is going to be obesity, because in an obese state, your lipolysis is upregulated. So you're releasing a lot more fatty acids, but you're not burning them the same way that a lean person might be. So they're kind of sitting there, and again, almost the best way to describe it is gumming up the insulin receptor by inhibiting these insulin-related proteins. Again, not exercising. So when fat is sitting inside of your muscle, so you have, fatty, what are called lipid droplets inside of your muscles, and they sit inside of your muscles. And lean people actually have a higher amount of fat stored inside of their muscles. But the reason is because they are actually oxidizing this fat during exercise. So the muscles can respond by increasing the amount that they store. But because they are flux, or the amount that's being oxidized compared to the amount that's being stored inside the muscle is essentially equal, if not higher, to the oxidation end, they don't develop this accumulation of free fatty acids that are inhibiting the insulin receptor. But in someone that is obese, they also have a high degree of fat inside of their muscle tissue. inside of their muscle cells. But it's not because they're utilizing it for energy. It's because their adipose tissue has essentially can't store any more body fat. So fat is being stored inside of the liver, inside of the muscles, and tissues like that. So in these people, unfortunately, they're not oxidizing the fat stored inside of their muscle, and it's much more likely to gum up the insulin receptor and lead to this insulin resistant state. So it's kind of like when you have an imbalance in fat oxidation and fat release, that's when insulin resistance is kickstarted. And it almost has virtually a very small amount to do with ingested carbohydrates and the increases and fluctuations in insulin in healthy people.
So were you kind of referring to the Randle cycle, like the competition between carbs and fat? Because I've heard different mentality on this. Like I've heard carnivore people say, that consuming fat and carbs in the same meal is a recipe for disaster. And then I've heard the other side where, like, pro-metabolic approach, you're in a really bad spot health-wise if you can't eat a meal with all the macronutrients together. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it looks like the Randle cycle may increase the likelihood that you store fatty acids and use glucose for energy. So when you're ingesting glucose and fat at the same time, you're probably going to store that fat and burn the glucose. And it may alter kind of the way that you burn fuels and the way that you partition fuels. And in some senses, yes, the Randle cycle can lead to this insulin resistant state if these fatty acids, we're not able to burn these fatty acids. So, we're burning glucose, and these fatty acids are essentially sitting inside of our cells. And then, they can be converted into diacylglycerols and free fatty acids. And then, once that happens, that's when the insulin receptor essentially becomes a little bit, we can become insensitive to insulin.
Yeah, I don't know if I can give up like my spaghetti meatballs with pasta, butter, olive oil, meatballs. Like I feel pretty good after eating that, but I don't know. It's quite a lot of carbs.
I think it's different for healthy people and unhealthy people. So essentially, like when you're pretty active, pretty fit, you have an ability to store fat. Like you have fatty acid reserves essentially that you can store more fat. But in someone that's overweight, their ability to store both glucose and fat is almost downregulated. So there are some studies indicating that someone who already has insulin resistance, they, even after ingesting glucose, their rates of what's called de novo lipogenesis, or the conversion of carbohydrates into fat, is upregulated drastically because they don't really have an ability to oxidize this glucose or even store it as glycogen. So in that scenario, we're drastically upregulating the amount of fat that's inside of our body. So we're increasing the susceptibility of developing insulin resistance at the muscle and at the liver. But in someone that's lean and healthy, they have stores to store this glucose. And even if they do go through de novo lipogenesis, again, they have reserves to store these fatty acids as well, so that they're not left available and unoxidized, which can lead to the insulin resistant phenotype that may occur alongside, obesity, where, their cells are releasing fatty acids and unable to store them, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, like it's not only calories in, calories out, but that's a lot to do with it. Like, are you consuming more than you're oxidizing or burning? Like, that's one solution. Is that the main one? Like, what are some solutions to this problem that you're talking about with overweight people?
So one thing that's important is that in someone who already has insulin resistance, a low carbohydrate diet may actually be better for them than a low fat diet when it comes to almost reversing this phenotype, because their ability to handle glucose is impaired. So doing a low carbohydrate diet may acutely almost give them a rest, essentially. And because they can't oxidize this glucose, this may make the problem worse. So in someone like that, a low carbohydrate diet may be beneficial, but if you're overeating on a lot of dietary fat and you maintain the same weight, then it probably won't help your insulin sensitivity at all. So you think about like the availability of fatty acids inside of our cells is dependent on the amount that are stored versus the amount that are burned. So if you're consuming a lot of fat and you're continuing to gain weight, even in healthy people, when you overeat, you become acutely more insulin resistant. Obviously, once you get into a period of time in which you're not overeating, your insulin sensitivity can come back quite drastically. And someone that already has a lot of fat stored on their body, even when they're not eating, because they have such an increased rate of lipolysis, they are almost always going to stay insulin resistant until they are able to get rid of some of this excess fat. So there's a lot of things that go into it, but most of it is losing weight in general and getting to a healthy body weight. You don't have to be underweight like I was. You just have to even losing a little bit of weight will gradually begin to restore insulin sensitivity. There are other things like micronutrient deficiencies can lead to insulin resistance. So if you don't have enough antioxidants, the production of molecules that can actually inhibit the insulin receptor also increases. So vitamin C, vitamin E, those things actually, just consuming those in the absence of weight loss can increase insulin sensitivity because of the way that those inflammatory cytokines can also inhibit the insulin receptor. Another thing is, even in overweight people, exercise will acutely decrease insulin resistance. So in someone who's overweight, even in the absence of weight loss, so they can stay the exact same body weight, when they exercise, they can acutely increase their insulin sensitivity. Understand that the insulin resistant phenotype comes back once they stop doing the exercise. So it's almost like if you want to stay overweight, the way to maintain insulin sensitivity while still being, at a larger body weight would be to exercise. But the second you stop exercising, that insulin resistance will come back.
I've heard with exercise, a lot of people are against, stress inducing exercise. Like, I've heard things about marathon runners, their organs shrinking and all sorts of things over the years, that being like the worst thing you could possibly do, to be like a long distance endurance runner. I know a lot of people are against cardio and they say only do high intensity and or weight training and never do, long distance running or anything like that. What are your thoughts on like, is that a real thing? Like stress inducing exercise kind of negating any benefit of what you just described?
So there are mechanisms by which catecholamines and cortisol can also, because they increase the availability of free fatty acids, they can induce insulin resistance, but this is typically only if you're not oxidizing those fatty acids before that. So let's say cortisol increased during exercise. Because you're going to be oxidizing those fatty acids for energy, they're not going to sit inside of your cells and begin kind of gumming up the insulin receptor. I will say that doing excessive cardio in the absence of weight training, you'll begin to catabolize your muscles. And, once there's not much muscles left to catabolize, there's a lot of other protein structures within your body that you can start breaking down. So you may have issues doing excessive cardio without any weight training and without the proper consumption of food. So it's essentially becoming underweight can be, obviously a bad thing because different things that you don't want to shrink will begin to shrink. Another thing that is really interesting is that in a starvation state, so when someone is not consuming food, so when they're fasting, they also become insulin resistant. And this is completely opposite of the obese state in which you become insulin resistant. But when you're not eating at all and you're going through, it's called starvation-induced insulin resistance. Because starvation increases the availability of these free fatty acids, since more of them are almost mobilized, this will begin to induce the insulin-resistant phenotype that a high-fat diet would do, because both of them increase the availability of fatty acids inside of the bloodstream. And again, these are situations where this is physiologic insulin resistance, because the glucose is being spared for the brain and those glucose-dependent tissues. And all those tissues that can run on fat will run on fat. The same is true for the hibernating bear. This starvation-induced, so when you're not eating, this insulin resistance is actually a positive thing. So it's, a beneficial thing. But if, doing a low carb diet, if you gave someone 100 grams of glucose after doing a low carb diet for 5 months, their glucose tolerance or their ability to get that glucose inside of their blood inside of their muscles and things like that, it would be pretty impaired. But this effect wears off. So it would go away quite rapidly. The same thing with starvation-induced insulin resistance. So, it would go away quite rapidly, just from the reintroduction of carbohydrates. So even one low carbohydrate meal. So if you ate low carbohydrate, the night before a glucose tolerance test. So it doesn't even have to be long-term long-term low carbohydrate. Just one low carbohydrate meal the night before a glucose tolerance test would probably does impair your glucose tolerance. So it's kind of like a beneficial adaptation to, keep you alive, keep you from, your brain from not being able to function.
And question, Calvin, is there an individual variation with a person's ability to store glycogen in the liver? Because that's something that I focused heavily on for a couple of years when I was, experimenting with like repeat ideas. And I believe he said that, a healthy person should be able to, or has the ability to store glycogen for like 23 hours or something like that. But an average person, low thyroid, average person on the planet doesn't have that ability. And so when the glycogen's depleted, the idea is cortisol and adrenaline go up and you start breaking down your muscle, releasing amino acids in your bloodstream, and then, releasing free fatty acids in the bloodstream. Are you, familiar with that idea, or what are your thoughts on it? Or
Yeah, so I mean, I guess when you become overweight and unhealthy, if you do become insulin resistant, the liver's resistance to insulin will decrease the amount of glucose that it will uptake. So they may not be able to store glucose inside of their liver just because, the signal that should be driving glucose into their liver, which would be insulin, their liver's not responding properly. So in these people, they may actually need more of a continuous glucose stream if they're doing the pro-metabolic eating, because it is true that their liver wouldn't be able to store a lot of glycogen because it doesn't have this, the correct signal. Additionally, there are, things that I would definitely say there are genetic predispositions to, maybe glycogen synthesis deficiencies, or even just impairments in each of the enzymes responsible for storing glycogen. So there's a lot of small things that may not even be that detrimental, but can alter, glycogen storage for some individuals. So you may have a 5% reduction in glycogen storage, or if you have multiple different, abnormalities in these enzymes, you may have a 20% decreased capacity to store glycogen. So it probably is individual dependent. And, as your glucose tolerance begins to decline, your glycogen storage will also begin to decline.
So it sounds like not to jump all over, but as questions come up, I want to ask. So with the glucose tolerance test, is that kind of your go-to if someone suspects that they're dealing with these issues, say they're overweight? Because a lot of what I've seen with the keto community is like the levels continuous glucose monitor, that you slap on your like tricep area, the fatty portion on your upper arm. And I think it was really enlightening for me. I mean, I experimented with taking different supplements with different dinners, berberine, dihydroberberine. Is there a difference? I don't think there was. Enzymes, apple cider vinegar. I was trying all these different combinations, and it was amazing. Some stacks that we did when, date night, go out and take supplements and see our blood glucose, it actually blunted even after pasta. It's amazing. Like you mentioned, micronutrient deficiencies, how powerful these things can be, not just vitamins, but like minerals and enzyme, other stuff, right?
Yes. I mean, there's a few things to touch on there. The first one would be like, so I would say the oral glucose tolerance test is the best way to understand your glucose tolerance, essentially. Because you can have normal fasting glucose, but have high fasting insulin. And that's what's, you need more insulin to keep that glucose under control. You may also have normal fasting insulin with high blood glucose. So some people's pancreas just don't make up for the fact that their, blood glucose is high. And in both situations, there's some sort of, abnormality with their proper insulin signaling. But when you're taking a glucose tolerance test, you're directly seeing in real time how well glucose, or a specific quantity of insulin is able to drive a specific quantity of glucose inside of your cells. So, the more cells that you have that are resistant to insulin, the more insulin you'll require to get the same amount of glucose into your cells. Whereas, if you're just looking at blood glucose, your body can maybe compensating by just drastically increasing insulin production. And you would have no idea unless you had like a continuous insulin monitor. That would be cool. That'd be an invention that I would want to see, a continuous glucose and insulin monitor.
Yeah, that would be awesome. So you said you could have normal fasting glucose, but also have high fasting insulin. And what was the other one? You could have normal fasting insulin, but high glucose?
Yeah, so some people, they'll see that their blood glucose will begin to rise on a specific diet. And it's not necessarily because they're becoming more insulin resistant, but because their pancreas isn't making up for the fact that their blood glucose is increasing by producing more insulin. So this would be more of an abnormality within the pancreas itself rather than an abnormality with insulin sensitivity. So some things could be driving up your blood glucose, but it doesn't mean that you're becoming insulin resistant. So there's like different things that all come into play, but when you can directly look at, the amount of insulin it takes to drive a specific quantity of glucose inside of your cells, then you can kind of really assess your insulin sensitivity, almost to the strongest degree without any other factors maybe, altering it. And coming back to the micronutrient deficiency thing, so almost all of the proteins that, function in the insulin response, the insulin signaling cascade, they'll require ATP. And as you may have learned from probably Morley, for every molecule of ATP requires a molecule of magnesium. So magnesium deficiency can also induce transient insulin resistance and so can an abnormality in ATP production. So, all of those micronutrients responsible for producing ATP inside of your cells, so the B vitamins, things like that, that can also drive an insulin resistant phenotype. And it might not even be because, you have increased circulating fatty acids, but because there are other downstream events that are causing this insulin resistance. And, the deficiency in certain micronutrients are responsible for sequestering inflammatory cytokines. They're decreasing the production of, different inflammatory molecules can also, increase their effects on insulin resistance. And one that I'm sure you and some of your listeners will and will not like is extremely high iron can also cause insulin resistance. So in hereditary hemochromatosis, 80-ish% of those people have insulin resistance. They used to call it bronze insulin resistance because this, increase in circulating iron can increase a lot of different things, including the production of these inflammatory molecules. Because while iron in normal concentrations is good, excess iron can actually damage cells. So different micronutrients and different dietary regimens can also, drastically alter your insulin resistance, regardless of macronutrients, weight, exercise, things like that.
Wow. Yeah. And I know on the flip side, iron deficiency, which is not synonymous with anemia, it could be that just being deficient in iron can also reduce the release of insulin and cause kind of similar issues, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're anemic and you're not delivering enough oxygen to your tissues, then you'll have an impaired ability to burn a lot of the substrate. So it may begin to accumulate, not necessarily because, you're not expending enough energy, but because certain tissues don't have enough oxygen to fully go through glycolysis and things like that.
Awesome. Well, you mentioned the continuous insulin monitor. I know some companies were looking at bundling the glucose monitor with ketone monitor. And I played around with Keto Mojo. I don't know if you've seen that brand. Like you prick your finger and you do a drop and you can check your blood ketones like first thing upon waking. Do you think that's useful at all, or if measuring ketones or exogenous ketones or any of that plays into what you've been talking about?
Yeah, so actually, I do like the idea of, being able to monitor ketones. So essentially, some people are able to eat 200 grams of carbohydrates and still manage to get back into ketosis by the morning. And this indicates that they're actually able to oxidize both glucose and fatty acids very efficiently. So if you have this really good metabolic flexibility, the likelihood that you're going to be unable to oxidize fatty acids and they'll begin to accumulate is probably a lot lower than someone who, despite eating zero carbohydrates, only produces about, 0.5 millimolar of ketones. These people may have, a drastically decreased tolerance to circulating fatty acids, and they're unable to use them. So I do think coupling, you know, ketone monitoring and glucose monitoring can give you a sense of where your metabolic flexibility is at and your capacity to burn both glucose and fat.
Hmm. Awesome. Um, Calvin, we have so many questions that listeners sent in. Do you want to jump into those, or is there other things that you wanted to cover before then, or what do you think?
I think that was it. I think there's, a lot
Uh,
to handle there. It might have been a little bit, sorry, I was a little bit, everywhere. There's just so much to cover in the realm of insulin resistance because,
it's a
one
huge
thing leads
topic.
into the next and like, oh, what about this? What about this? So,
Yeah.
hopefully that was as concise as it could be.
Well, that was great. Yeah, and I think the questions might help too to reel it in to get specific with, you know, if someone has the same question that's still there from the beginning of the podcast, hopefully we'll answer it now. Um, let's see, find a good one to start with. Um, any way to quickly lower insulin? So I don't know if we covered that. I think um talked quite a bit about exercise. It's probably like the easiest way, right?
Yeah, so I'd say the fastest way to lower insulin resistance or improve your glucose tolerance is to get glucose into your cells without the requirement of insulin at all. So, doing exercise can do that. And then this exercise will oxidize some of those fatty acids inside of your muscles, which may transiently reduce the amount of, fatty acids that are inhibiting the insulin receptor. So, again, like even in obese people, if they exercise, they will acutely, drastically increase their insulin sensitivity, even regardless of weight loss. But they have to maintain this exercise if they don't lose weight, they'll have to maintain this exercise to maintain the same insulin sensitivity. Whereas
Hmm.
someone who's healthy may not even need to do much exercise, and they'll always be more insulin sensitive than someone who is overweight by and large. But there are also genetic predispositions to be a little bit more insulin resistant at the same body weight. So this is referred
Hmm.
to as like the personal fat threshold. It's a bit of a tangent,
Hmm.
but it does appear that people in like Asian and Indian cultures, their personal fat threshold is lower, meaning
Hmm.
that they become insulin resistant at far lower body weights than someone of like a European or African descent. So Matt might be 300 pounds and I might be 150 pounds, but we may have the same degree of insulin resistance depending on some of our genetic predispositions to become or not to become insulin resistant. So you can see some people that are 500 or 600 pounds and they're very insulin sensitive. Conversely, we see people with lipodystrophy. These people have essentially zero fat storage anywhere inside of their body other than inside of their liver. And their liver becomes extremely insulin resistant. And then this leads to almost like a whole body insulin resistance.
Hmm.
So if you just measured their blood work and didn't look at their body weight and the way that they looked, you would think they were extremely overweight, even though they're actually probably underweight and quite lean because they're storing a lot of fat inside of their organs and specifically inside of their liver.
Interesting. Huh. I'm going to bundle together these two questions because one of them is very specific. So, what does he think about utilizing chromium supplementation? And then another broad one, what are the best supplements for lowering blood sugar and the best time to take them?
So timing wise would probably be, alongside a higher carbohydrate meal, but for some of them, timing isn't all that important. One thing is melatonin can actually transiently make you insulin resistant. So maybe taking melatonin at night can be beneficial, but you probably wouldn't want to eat an extremely high carbohydrate meal right at bed. Chromium and other trace elements can be beneficial, but it does appear that they're not as impactful as some of the more understood micronutrients. So chromium can be helpful to an extent, but it won't rectify a lot of the issues we talked about earlier. Another one that could be helpful is zinc. So zinc is actually important for proper the production of all of these insulin proteins and the actual insulin receptor itself. So zinc is important in that process of making sure that the insulin receptor is stable and functioning.
Hmm.
So very minor micronutrient deficiencies can impair insulin sensitivity, and chromium appears to be something that can actually increase insulin sensitivity, but it probably isn't an underlying factor driving the insulin resistance, if that makes any sense.
Interesting. Uh, how to lower blood sugar that's always around 100? And kind of a addition that I want to make to that is it possible that that's okay, that number? Like, is it in the research that you've looked at, and I think Levels actually had a really great blog kind of breaking down the different studies on this, because they have their numbers they publish on their website, like and that's stricter and lower than, standard recommendations for average, fasting blood glucose or after meal blood glucose. Yeah, well, I don't think we covered that. Like the mainstream, recommendations, are they way too high, or what do you think?
So I would say 100 is getting a little bit high. So it might actually be an indication that there is some sort of like, maybe in that sense, maybe if you have a, pretty normal diet, not extremely low carbohydrate, and, you have a fairly healthy body weight, that might be a sign that you have some sort of underlying like nutrient deficiency or some sort of underlying inflammation that might be driving your glucose up. So that could be something to look at. One thing you could also look at is your HbA1c. So if you have a fasting blood glucose of 100, so sorry, let me backtrack a little bit. The HbA1c is kind of a 90-day average of your blood glucose, if that makes any sense. So this is looking at your glycated hemoglobin, so your glycated red blood cells. And the more chronically exposed your body is to blood glucose, the more of these red blood cells will become glycated. And you can actually measure this by measuring your HbA1c. So if you have really high HbA1c and you have high fasting glucose, this is probably an indication that you're going to be more at risk of some of the micro and macrovascular effects of insulin resistance or high blood glucose. But if you have really low HbA1c, this may actually just be, a sign of increased glucose flux, if that makes any sense. So you may be very rapidly oxidizing glucose, so your bloodstream is a little bit higher, or you may be rapidly oxidizing fat, and some of this glucose is just being spared for your brain. But if it isn't causing, a large degree of glycation, then it might not be a bad thing. But, I wouldn't say there's harm in lowering it, if that makes any sense. So almost like a safeguard against extremely high blood glucose, because I wish I could tell you exactly what it was doing to your vascular system and things like that, but you would never know.
Yeah, I used to dive into like advanced glycation end products, and when I was like fasting 23 hours a day and just obsessed with with lowering AGEs. But that's just one of many aspects, right, that can come from one of the many harms that can come from elevated blood glucose chronically.
Yeah, definitely. Like, there's a lot of cardiovascular risk factors that insulin resistance increases. And, this blood glucose can also impair your ability to kind of get water into and out of your cells, if that makes any sense. So it may increase blood pressure and then all of the bad things that come along with higher blood pressure.
Hmm. This is
And if
interesting.
you did,
Oh,
sorry to
go
cut
ahead.
you off, but if
No
there
worries.
was like, if you had higher blood glucose, that might be an indication that some of your cells are all actually deficient in glucose, if that makes
Hmm.
any sense, because
Hmm.
more of it's staying inside of your bloodstream. So at that point, you may come into issues with essentially low glucose inside of your cells.
Hmm. What are your thoughts on different probiotic strains to reverse insulin resistance?
So I did read a fair bit about the impact of the gut microbiome on insulin resistance. So it appears they can increase and decrease the production of different, inflammatory cytokines, which can increase or decrease insulin sensitivity. They can also produce different, like essentially different glucose metabolites that may increase or decrease insulin sensitivity. So there are ways that the gut microbiome can alter our insulin sensitivity. While it probably isn't the underlying, the biggest thing, it does play a role. But the thing is, there's so many different probiotics, and I guess the point of a probiotic is to give it to someone and hope that it has an effect. But we don't always know if a certain probiotic is going to have the effect that we're looking for. Additionally, if you're buying a cheaper probiotic, who knows what's actually in there, things like that. So you could potentially, maybe talk to a gastroenterologist or someone who knows a lot about the gut microbiome, have your gut microbiome tested, and then look at what you could possibly supplement with. But one important thing is that alongside this, you would probably want to add in prebiotics to make sure that these probiotics don't just die off, if you stop taking the supplement. You want to give them food to kind of repopulate and things like that. Another thing that can feed these probiotics or feed these bacteria are polyphenols. So,
Mhm.
as much as the carnivore crowd probably doesn't want to hear it, having some fiber, some fruits, and some vegetables can also help you almost make use of the probiotics that you're putting in, so that you don't need to keep supplementing with them for life. Because if you're putting probiotics onto an unhealthy microbiome, you're not giving these probiotics any food. As soon as you stop taking them, they're almost always going to disappear.
Hmm. This is a really specific one, and if you haven't looked into it, but that's fine. It seems like you've looked into a lot though, so you probably have heard of it. Someone says, let's talk about pediatric glycogen storage disorder and ketotic hypoglycemia. Any thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, I haven't looked too much into it. I know what it is, like I know of it. And it's kind of like a diabetic ketoacidosis state, essentially. I would presume it's like if you have high glucose in tandem with high ketones, that's just a sign that there's excessive lipolysis and excessive glucose production. And in that scenario, the excessive lipolysis is probably contributing to insulin resistance. And then, you're unable to get this glucose out of your bloodstream. So you're going to have concomitant high blood glucose and high blood ketones because your body is essentially releasing all these fuels, but you're unable to uptake them into your cells. So but again, that's something that would be screened extremely early on and be recognized early on. And, the doctor would probably choose what to do in that scenario. So it wouldn't be something that I probably wouldn't go to someone, online or something like that to help with that. That would be something that you'd want to talk to a doctor about. And because unfortunately, in some of those scenarios, you would need some sort of medication, something like that.
Mm-hmm. What are ideal hemoglobin A1C and fasting insulin levels? What's ideal? What does pre-diabetes mean?
I mean, it's essentially like there's kind of a specific threshold by which diabetes is diagnosed at a specific HbA1c. And anything under this would technically be non-diabetic. But there is a range right before you tip into diabetic that would be considered pre-diabetes. It's kind of, it does put these numbers onto something that we probably shouldn't be putting numbers on, because you probably want to treat pre-diabetes just the same way you would treat diabetes. So, but a lot of doctors, they won't make any measurements, or they won't take any, do anything with their patients until they surpass a specific HbA1c. But, as you begin to dip into prediabetes, there's all of these adverse ramifications that are occurring even before you're technically surpassed the diabetic threshold. I'm not sure the exact, I could probably look it up right now, but finding the exact numbers for HbA1c, but I wouldn't say it would be in the normal range, because if you're on the high end of the normal range, then you might want to take steps to try and lower your HbA1c. You probably want to be on the middle to lower end of the normal range, because understand that normal range doesn't necessarily mean the healthiest range or the optimal range. They're kind of just normal ranges for the population. So, most people don't want to, especially people listening to your podcast, probably don't want to be like the average population. They probably want to be a little bit better. So getting it towards the middle to lower range of HbA1c and fasting insulin may be a better, good idea. And one thing with fasting insulin is you may actually have a better marker to look at in C-peptide. So when the pancreas releases insulin, it concomitantly releases C-peptide. But this C-peptide stays in the bloodstream for a little bit longer. So it gives you a little bit more of an accurate indicator of what your insulin actually is in your average insulin levels. So C-peptide may be a little bit more of a specific marker to measure almost your 24-hour insulin production, rather than, because there's a lot of things that can impact your insulin on the day that you take the test that is kind of out of your control. But this C-peptide may be a little bit more of a better reflection of your insulin.
What are your thoughts on Ozempic?
Yeah, I have a lot of videos talking about GLP-1. So I think GLP-1 is important, and Ozempic can be, life-saving for a lot of people. But there's actually a lot of dietary things that we can do to mimic Ozempic, by, increasing the production of GLP-1. So it's almost like Ozempic may be too much of a good thing. So GLP-1 is good, but Ozempic may decrease your appetite so much that you don't eat enough protein. So people that are taking Ozempic typically lose a lot of muscle while they're losing weight. It may also decrease gastric emptying too much so that you have a lot of gas, bloating, fermentation, and some people get peristalsis. or sorry, some people get gastroparesis, where it's almost like paralysis of the intestinal tract, which can lead to nausea and things like that. So Ozempic can be helpful, but if we can mimic Ozempic using our diet, that might be a little bit more beneficial to get more of like physiological GLP-1 signaling. So this would be, there are very specific things that increase the production of GLP-1. So protein and calcium, a mixture of the two appears to be more beneficial than just protein itself. So eating something that's high in protein and calcium, the one that I always go to is like sardines. Um, and then eating carbohydrates in like their whole food form. So the more complex something is to break down, or the more difficult it is to break down, the farther down your gastrointestinal tract it will travel. And the cells that will produce GLP-1 are actually located a little bit farther down your gastrointestinal tract. So when you're ingesting like a very simple sugar that's absorbed very rapidly, the production of GLP-1 isn't as high as if you had eaten the same amount of carbohydrates that have a little bit more fiber or are a little bit more complex, because it just won't make it down your gastrointestinal tract as far. So looking at things like fiber, obviously things with fiber can help inhibit extremely rapid absorption and allow it to travel a little bit farther, as well as just complex carbohydrates rather than simple sugars. So instead of drinking your apple, eat the apple. And potatoes and other complex carbohydrate sources may be a little bit more beneficial than extremely rapidly digesting carbohydrate sources like cereals and things like that. So as much as some people don't want to hear it, the more difficult it is to digest it, the easier it might, or the better it might be for production of GLP-1. And I'd say food's a lot cheaper than the GLP-1 supplement or an Ozempic medication, depending on your healthcare and things like that.
I've heard a trending influencer in the health community like talk about eating fiber first at your meal, and like it's all about the order of what you eat. Like eat the salad first before you have your pasta or whatever. Do you generally agree with that, or are there nuances to it? Or
I definitely say there's nuances. So like if you already have like for me, if I ate a salad before I ate like a carbohydrate source, because of my like IBS essentially, it would really inhibit my absorption of a lot of food. So that might actually be a non-beneficial thing, especially so for someone who already has issues with gas and bloating and gastrointestinal issues. Slowing down the absorption of your food may not be a beneficial thing. Whereas for someone who's trying to feel fuller while eating, so eating a salad prior to a meal will decrease the consumption of calories in that meal. Even on top of the calories that the salad is adding into your meal, you'll probably decrease the consumption of the rest of your meal such that by the end of the meal, you would eat less calories. So we see that with salads, even just eating an apple before a meal can do that. So that can be a beneficial thing just to regulate appetite. So without counting calories, you can just decrease your caloric consumption. I think the big view is that it will decrease your blood glucose spike, whereas this isn't necessarily always a good thing. Like I think as long as you can regulate your blood glucose back down to a normal range, the height at which your glucose rises and the speed at which it rises may not actually be all that important. Whereas someone who's already insulin resistant and they can't get their blood glucose back down to normal, trying to negate an extremely high spike in blood glucose may be a beneficial thing because, they don't really have the ability to get this glucose out of their bloodstream. So the higher it goes, the higher it's going to stay. And there's important things like that. But let's say you eat the salad first, and then that decreases the amount of protein that you're consuming. And then at that point, you may not be eating enough protein for the day, and you suffer some of the consequences like that. So I think it's very individual dependent.
uh, do you think gas and bloating that isn't excessive is normal? Because that's another thing I've been meditating on recently. Because I think that actually is a key reason why a lot of people go carnivore, at least is my understanding. And I've heard this time and time again that, I think Dave Asprey said it, that, oh, I stopped eating, as much of the anti-nutrients and it wasn't gassy. And, he told a story on a plane or whatever, where it was embarrassing. Um, uh, to me, intuitively, it makes sense that it's normal if we're eating fiber that you're going to have some of that, because that's just a byproduct of, and there's different gases that are created, right? It's not just methane.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, interesting stuff there. So if you have extremely excessive gas and bloating and maybe some smelly gas, that might be a negative side effect. But, you know, I actually made a video on this. There's like a guy named Bear Grylls who eats a carnivore
Oh
diet, and
yeah.
he said he
Okay, I
hasn't
saw
passed
that. Yeah.
gas.
Yeah.
Yeah, he hasn't passed gas in multiple years. In that sense, that may not be a beneficial thing. So you think when you're feeding the bacteria inside of your intestinal tract, one of the byproducts of them fermenting things is the production of gas. But another byproduct is the production of beneficial compounds like short chain fatty acids. So,
And you said hydrogen too in the video, right?
yeah, and hydrogen, a lot of people, as you may know, are hydrogenating their water. They're adding hydrogen into their water and drinking it because hydrogen can be a pretty potent antioxidant, almost like vitamin C. But your gut bacteria produce hydrogen as well. And the way that this happens is you give them fermentable fiber or fermentable food, and certain bacteria can produce hydrogen. So it would definitely depend on essentially the health of your gut microbiome. Unfortunately, we know so little about the gut microbiome. I couldn't just tell you eat this food and it'll produce hydrogen. Um, there are certain people have these hydrogen producing bacteria, and when they consume fiber, this hydrogen is beneficial. Other people may have bacteria that produce different gases that may not be as beneficial. And for these people, the reduction in fiber transiently may be a good thing. It's interesting. I believe it's the Maasai tribe. Um, they've been consuming milk for a very long time, but a lot of them are still lactose intolerant. But one important thing is that when lactose goes undigested, some of the bacteria inside of your intestinal tract can ferment this lactose and produce hydrogen. So this may have actually almost been an adaptation to increase the amount of hydrogen that they produce by some of the population being, slightly or very lactose intolerant, because this allows them to almost get the benefits of the hydrogen produced by the bacteria inside of their large intestine.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, what are the main causes of gestational diabetes, and can it lead to insulin resistance?
So I would say gestational diabetes essentially is insulin resistance. So diabetes is, the inability to regulate blood glucose. And that's because your cells are resistant to the signal, the insulin, to get glucose inside of your cells. There's an interesting phenomenon that happens, as you may have actually heard in some of like the ketogenic diet atmospheres, is if you're taking a gestational diabetes test, you probably want to reintroduce carbohydrates a few days before you're taking that test. Because if you go into that test extremely low carbohydrate and extremely high fat, you're almost assuredly going to come back with the numbers that indicate gestational diabetes because of this mechanism by which these fatty acids can inhibit the insulin receptor. This is a transient thing, so reintroducing carbohydrates can ameliorate this within 24 to 48 hours. But when you're extremely low on consumed glucose, your muscles and your liver will become resistant to allow that glucose for your brain. But, again, you become a little bit less glucose tolerant. So if you're taking a gestational diabetes test, you probably wouldn't want to go into it extremely carbohydrate restricted or extremely low calorie, because again, this almost like starvation state can also mimic, this physiological insulin resistance and decrease your tolerance to this glucose. And then the other things would essentially just be, micronutrient deficiencies. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's just a genetic predisposition. A lot of times it's the consumption of a lot of food and, becoming overweight in the process of trying to eat more to feed the baby. So I wouldn't say that I'm an expert specifically in this, because there's a lot of different things that go into properly feeding yourself and make sure you're getting enough nutrients for the adolescent. But I would say kind of maintaining proper, like essentially healthy food. So eating a lot of micronutrients, a lot of essential fatty acids. So sometimes, there's different opinions on omega-3s, but consuming omega-3s can actually decrease insulin resistance a little bit, especially compared to like saturated fats and things like that. And another option would be to decrease the amount of meals that you're consuming that are high in both sugar and saturated fat, because both of those things can build up or simultaneously induce a slight insulin resistance. And when consumed together, this may actually make insulin resistance a little bit worse.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, it's funny the omega-3 thing. I love cod liver oil. I feel great on it, but there's vitamin A in there and other stuff that's even like undiscovered. So
Yeah, there's some interesting, like different fatty acids can alter insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity a lot. So omega 7s and omega 9s actually appear to be beneficial, as well as omega 3s. And then omega 6s, not as much, but as unfortunate it is, saturated fat appears to be the worst for insulin sensitivity acutely. But again, this may just be because the body is much more likely to burn off omega 6s before it burns the saturated fats. So this is something that I've had a hard time wrapping my head around, because I wouldn't want to recommend people limit saturated fat because, while I wouldn't overconsume saturated fat in the context of an isocaloric diet or a diet where you're losing weight, the consumption of saturated fat probably isn't going to be detrimental, but it might be one of those macronutrients you just wouldn't want to drastically overconsume on, the way that you probably wouldn't want to overconsume fructose, because there are, side effects of overconsumption that are different than just normal glucose or even monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats.
this is a fun one. What is the truth about sugar consumption? How do sweeteners influence blood sugar? And this is something that I have a lot of experience with, and I have a frequent guest on the show that buys 50-pound bags of white sugar. It's Adam Bergstrom, and he's very proud of how much white sugar he consumes. And he says the brown is colored and artificially. And I've experimented extensively with white sugar, not brown sugar, but white sugar, honey, maple syrup, and then all the keto sweeteners, the stevia, the xylitol, the monk fruit, different products. What are your thoughts on all those things? And I guess we could start with the real sweeteners like white sugar, honey, maple syrup.
Yeah, I mean, I think unlike a lot of people, I don't really think that fructose is the devil. I think unless you're over consuming fructose, so the extent to which you are in a caloric surplus, the more fructose you're consuming, likely the more fat that will accumulate like inside of your liver. But if you're consuming, fructose in a diet that is allowing you to maintain a healthy body weight, there really isn't much evidence indicating that it's going to have any detrimental effect. There really actually isn't any. And especially like the fructose found in fruit and things like that, obviously that's great. One big thing with sugar is just for a lot of people, it's not satiating. So when they add sugar to things, they're going to consume more food, more calories, and be more likely to overconsume energy, by the end of the day. So if you're gaining weight, the consumption of sugar may be a little bit more detrimental than the consumption of like just, starches and things like that. But the extent to which it is detrimental, we can't really quantify, I would say. When it comes to sweeteners, it's interesting because it really depends on the sweetener and it depends on the person. So some people say that sweeteners will cause a cephalic phase insulin response. And when you look at it, certain sweeteners do, but only in certain people. And after you've been consuming these sweeteners for a period of time, it actually appears that, if you do have a cephalic insulin response, you kind of stop having this response. So it's almost like an adaptation period. So when it comes to glucose control, even if you had a CGM, that may actually be something you could try out. See which ones do and do not alter your blood glucose. That might be a beneficial thing. The idea or the studies on the microbiome are interesting because the word is gut dysbiosis. So these sweeteners call it gut dysbiosis. But in some of these studies, if you look at the gut dysbiosis is simply just a change in the bacteria inside of your stomach. And, this could technically fiber for some people will cause gut dysbiosis because it changes the bacteria inside of their stomach. So gut dysbiosis doesn't necessarily mean something bad is happening. And in some of these studies, looking at the way that artificial sweeteners change your gut microbiome, some of the bacteria that they increase have positive effects for glucose tolerance and positive effects throughout the body. So I think when people tell you it causes gut dysbiosis, they probably haven't read the study to see what actually changes and how this effect is, because we don't really know what the effect is. Because some of the bacteria changes are considered bad, some of them are considered good, but it's also the quantity and the magnitude that they change. So there's so much we don't know about the gut microbiome that just a change in the gut microbiome from artificial sweeteners, we can't tell you if that's good or bad. And for a lot of people, they've done studies where they compare, water versus a non-nutritive sweetened beverage. And it actually appears that the groups consuming the non-nutritive sweetened beverages, or the ones with artificial sweeteners, they lose more weight by the end of the study. There was a recent one done it was 52 weeks of water versus like an artificially sweetened beverage. And the group consuming the artificial sweeteners lost more weight. Whereas a lot of people will tell you, they'll make you more hungry. But this it doesn't appear to be something that we see. One thing is, if you add artificial sweeteners onto a meal that already contains sugar, it may cause you to eat more. So a lot of companies will, to make their foods more palatable, add in artificial sweeteners. But it appears that if you're replacing sugar-sweetened beverages with artificially sweetened beverages, you're better off for it. If you're replacing water with an artificially sweetened beverage, I would say go for the water. But if the artificial sweetened beverage doesn't cause you to overconsume and it allows you to consume less calories, then in the net balance of things, it might actually be more beneficial than, if you hadn't consumed it, if that makes any sense. Because the biggest thing is just regulating body weight.
We've been just doing, like when we go out to eat, just hot water with lemon, and then bring like a tea bag, like ginger. And that feels really good on digestion, like some lemon, some ginger. And that's been kind of my go-to drink. But that was great. What are your thoughts, actually, if you looked into question from me on alcohol consumption affecting insulin? You research that?
Yeah, so I'd say as you might expect, alcohol consumption causes insulin resistance, and it's likely because when we consume alcohol, we're going to inhibit the oxidation of pretty much every other fuel until that alcohol is metabolized. So fat will accumulate inside of the liver, and it goes unoxidized and can essentially cause liver insulin resistance. So when you consume alcohol, your liver becomes insulin resistant, and that kind of triggers the cascade of almost a whole body insulin resistant response. So I would say that, as much as it would be cool if we could consume alcohol, it does appear to impair insulin sensitivity.
What about the connection between insulin and PCOS? Actually, I had quite a few questions. I think this is a really common issue. Polycystic ovarian syndrome. Is there a connection there?
Yeah, I haven't gotten to look into this as much as I wanted to. So I'd kind of say I'll reserve my comments on it right now because I don't want to say anything incorrect, but there does appear to be a connection. The way that it goes, from what I understand, it looks like it's because insulin can increase steroidogenesis, and excessive testosterone production due to high insulin levels may lead to some of the symptoms of PCOS. But, again, I would want to reserve, anything that I give out until I can give you some actual truthful information. I don't want to say anything wrong.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a Band-Aid or a root cause fix, but I've heard anecdotal reports that systemic enzymes improve their PCOS. So that's just an interesting thing to note. What is a good approach to improve NAFLD, so non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? And is that condition related to excess carb consumption?
So it's interesting. So it does appear when you're over consuming food, specifically fructose and saturated fats are the worst for fatty liver. Saturated fats are actually a lot worse than fructose is, whereas most people in the low carbs field will go after the fructose but not say anything about the saturated fats. So both of those things appear to increase the production of fat and storage of fat inside of the liver. Again, it's probably because these saturated fats are more easily stored than unsaturated fats. And the fructose, because it's metabolized in the liver, if you're over consuming, it's more likely to end up as fat. Sorry, one second. It's more likely to end up as fat inside of the liver than something like glucose would be. But insulin resistance itself can actually drive fat inside of the liver. And then the fat inside of the liver can transiently drive the insulin resistance. So it's almost like a feedback cycle. So, and the liver actually appears to be the organ that becomes resistant to insulin along with the muscles before the rest of the body would. So if you develop fatty liver, the likelihood that you'll develop diabetes is drastically increased. And the other thing that could affect this is the same thing again, like this hemochromatosis or excessively high iron can also damage the liver and increase your susceptibility to, fatty liver and things like that. But it's almost predominantly or mainly driven by being overweight, which drives, again, resistance to insulin inside of the liver and then all of those things downstream of that.
This is a great one. Will eating fruit spike blood sugar differently when you consume it by itself versus after fats or proteins?
So I guess when you're looking at spiking, the answer would be yes. So the fats can delay the amount of or the height of your glucose spike, but it's not going to, alter the amount of glucose that enters your bloodstream, in the end of it. So it also may prolong the amount of time that you spend with slightly elevated blood glucose. So essentially your area under the curve or, the amount of glucose that enters into your bloodstream after consuming fruit, regardless of whether you consume it with fat or without fat, is going to be the same. But the actual curve may just look a little bit different.
Got it. What about the difference between men and women for reversing insulin resistance? Is there a difference?
I would say for reversing it, no, but it does appear that women have a slightly decreased susceptibility to insulin resistance. And the reason for this is actually pretty interesting. So estrogen can cause what's referred to as fat cell hyperplasia. So essentially fat tissue can expand in two ways: hypertrophy or hyperplasia. Hypertrophy is just the growing of pre-existing cells, and hyperplasia is when you duplicate cells, so essentially going from one fat cell to two fat cells. Perfect. And as you can see, those hyperplastic is how they're referred to. Those hyperplastic fat cells are smaller. And when the more fat, like lipids inside of a fat cell, the more likely it is for these lipids to begin leaking out and causing the insulin resistance. So the more hyperplasia that we can have, the smaller our fat cells will be and the less fat they will store. So the more capable they are to essentially keep this fat inside of the lipid droplet and not allow it to leak out into the cell and allow it to, bind to the insulin receptor and begin causing like the insulin malfunctioning. So because women produce more estrogen, they typically will actually have to gain a little bit more weight than men to cause insulin resistance. Additionally, men are more susceptible to the accumulation of fat in the abdominal region. And this appears to be probably the most detrimental fat when it comes to insulin resistance, because most of this fat will be immediately, right next to the liver. So you're more likely to develop fatty liver as a man versus a woman, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. This is a good one. Can type 1 diabetes be reversed in adolescence?
So there are some anecdotes of people, who are just diagnosed with type 1 diabetes being able to essentially reverse type 1 diabetes or inhibiting it from progressing. And I mean, it's been shown on essentially any diet that you want, a fruitarian diet, a carnivore diet. It's been shown on both, actually. Once you've had it for a while, really one of the only ways to reverse it is to do some sort of like stem cell therapy where you essentially reproduce the pancreatic cells that died off as a result of the autoimmune attack, which caused the type 1 diabetes. Some people, I'm sure there are anecdotes of people reversing it after they've had it for multiple years. In some sense, there isn't like one protocol that you could give everyone to say, do this and it'll reverse it. And for most people, unfortunately, like reversing it just won't happen. But there are some anecdotes of, just altering their diet and reversing type 1 diabetes. But this typically occurs if, almost immediately after it was diagnosed. So right after it manifested, if you get on it really, really quickly, there's a chance that you could, essentially halt its progression or even reverse it. But, the likelihood that it will happen is very small. So if someone's telling you that they can reverse type 1 diabetes in everyone, they're either trying to sell you something or they just probably don't know what they're talking about.
I think this is related to something you mentioned earlier. they've been doing carb cycling for a while, and they're still getting bloated after eating carbs. What would you recommend they could try?
Well, if you're getting a little bit bloated and you're eating a lot of fiber, then it may not be a bad thing as long as this bloating doesn't last all day, and as long as this bloating isn't excessive. If you're bloated but you're not becoming gassy, this may actually be a sign that the gas that is being produced is a type of gas that will travel upwards instead of downwards. There are specific type of gases that may go upwards, and this may be something that you want to look into a little bit more. But really, the only way that you could fix some of these things would be probably to get a microbiome test and to look into what all is going on, so you can figure out which bacteria may be in abundance, which bacteria may be too low, and then trying to rectify it that way. So I'd probably defer to someone who's a little bit more of an expert on the microbiome. There are interesting anecdotes of people doing fecal microbiome transplants, where essentially consuming someone else's feces can help alter your gut microbiome, and it can radically increase or decrease a lot of things. So unfortunately, some people get these transplants and they start becoming obese, even consuming the same food, because the gut bacteria do have a pretty significant effect on the amount of metabolizable energy that we can, essentially absorb from our food. So some obese people may just be really, really efficient at absorbing calories from their food. So to lose weight, they may have to eat less calories than someone who's really inefficient. So, the gut microbiome can alter a lot, but we just know so little about it that there's not, there aren't good recommendations for everyone. One thing you could try is, altering the foods and trying to keep your diet pretty consistent. This is something that worked for me because I can't tolerate that many foods. There's a lot of food groups that I just had to cut out because of, a lot of the malabsorption issues I have. Certain foods that become malabsorbed, they cause a lot of gastrointestinal distress. So trying to keep your diet fairly constant and including or excluding specific things and seeing what causes bloating, what makes it worse. And if this bloating doesn't come along with any negative symptoms other than, a little bit of a pooch for a little bit of time, I couldn't tell you that it's necessarily going to be pathological.
This is a good one. Does grazing or snacking throughout the day contribute to insulin resistance? From listening to you, it's my understanding that it depends on the person. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that at the end of the day, grazing and snacking is probably going to lead to, overconsumption of calories. So you're more likely to develop some of the insulin resistance that come along with overconsumption. But I guess this kind of hints back at the idea that a lot of people view insulin resistance as a problem with elevating insulin. So, the more you're snacking, the more you are increasing and decreasing insulin. So you are more likely to become insulin resistant. Whereas unless you are, actively becoming overweight or you're very sedentary, this, alteration in insulin and blood glucose isn't the main driver of insulin resistance. So, if you're snacking all day long and you're maintaining a caloric deficit or, a healthy body weight and you're exercising and things like that, then insulin resistance won't manifest just because, you may have you may have your insulin elevated for longer periods of the day than someone who's fasting 23 hours and eating only one meal, if that makes any sense. And another one of the issues with snacking a lot of times is just insufficient protein intake. So one of the things that drives, the muscle growth response is a specific elevation in amino acids in the bloodstream, and you want to surpass a certain threshold. So if you're snacking on protein throughout the day, so you're eating like 10 grams at a time, every hour on the hour, you may not hit this blood amino acid concentration to really drive protein synthesis to the best of your degree or to the best of your capabilities. So at that point, you may be better off having defined meals and not snacking in between. And these defined meals being higher in protein rather than kind of just snacking or sipping on protein all day long may not actually be as beneficial as just eating high protein meals, but skipping in between and just eating those defined meals.
So how would one find or is it established like the amount of protein to cause that response? Is it 20 grams, 30 grams? Depends on the person.
I'd say it definitely depends on the person, their muscle mass and things like that. Even their ability to absorb protein. So some people have low hydrochloric acid, so they have kind of an impaired ability to absorb protein. Another thing, I mean, we just had a study that came out looking at the difference between 0 grams, 25 grams, and 100 grams of protein. And they found that the group consuming 100 grams had a far greater increase in protein synthesis compared to the group consuming 25 grams. There's a lot of things that we can and can't take from this study. So, if maybe the difference between 50 grams and 100 grams would be minimal, maybe there would be no difference. So we can't say that, just keep increasing protein.
And that's over a day, right? That's not just one meal. That's over the course of the day.
That was actually in one meal. So they consumed 100 grams in one meal. So
okay.
One thing, they consume casein protein. We know that in order to get the same, protein synthetic response as 25 grams of whey protein, you would need about 30 to 35 or even 40 grams of casein protein. So you need more casein protein to stimulate the same anabolic response as like whey protein. So that's one underlying thing that may be conflating the results of this study. Another thing is, again, they didn't look at 50 or 75 grams. 75 and 100 may be exactly the same. So it doesn't mean that constantly eating more protein will just linearly increase muscle growth. That would be great. We could just eat 100 grams of protein at every meal and just continue to grow muscle endlessly. But it does appear that, eating higher amounts of protein every meal you're not going to the typical view of you're just wasting protein. You're probably not going to be wasting this protein. You may get some benefits, but the benefits of protein consumption are kind of like it's referred to as an asymptote. So essentially, when you go from 0 to 25 grams, the benefits go up pretty drastically. But once you get beyond 25 grams, the benefits kind of go up ever so slightly. So again, 25 grams for someone who's 100 pounds is a lot different than 25 grams for someone who's 300 pounds. So with a lot of muscle, obviously. So it probably will depend on your body weight. There's a lot of, gram per kilogram calculations or gram per pound calculations that may be a little bit more helpful for someone who is trying to assess their protein intake based on their body weight. It might be, I believe it's like, no, I don't want to give a wrong estimate, but if you look up, gram per kilogram of body weight of protein intake per meal, that might give you a better estimation. But going below 25 grams may be a little bit worse than 25 grams, and going above 25 grams may be slightly better than 25 grams, but the degree to which it's better, I couldn't give you a number on it.
Awesome. Another question for me. Earlier, you mentioned that insulin influences POMC, neuropeptide Y, and then leptin. I've heard people talk a lot about. I think I had a guest talking about like leptin resistance, and a lot of health educators recommend eating like a large amount of protein, like front loading it in the morning, especially to kind of set the leptin signal. So having 50 grams of protein first thing in the morning. Do you think that's a good thing, or?
Yes, there's a few things there. One thing is that leptin resistance and insulin resistance appear to go alongside one another. And what causes what is still kind of left to be determined, whether insulin resistance is causing leptin resistance or converse, leptin resistance is causing insulin resistance. So those two things do appear to come in tandem a lot. And I will say front-loading protein and front-loading calories in general is something that I've had to change my opinion on a lot. So at the beginning of, not at the very beginning, but, midway through the journey, I was one of those people that would tell you that meal timing means absolutely nothing. You could eat one meal a day every day, and as long as you're getting enough protein, enough, in the right caloric balance, there's no difference. But looking into the literature on chrononutrition, so the timing of your meals, it's actually pretty evident that, front loading both protein and calories at the beginning of the day is more beneficial for muscle gain, appetite regulation, and for overall weight loss than if you were backloading your calories, so eating most of your calories at the end of the day. Obviously, if the only way that you're going to maintain a caloric deficit is by eating a really big dinner, then you're going to be better off doing that. But if appetite isn't the thing that you're trying to manage and you have no issue eating a big breakfast and a small dinner, you'd probably be better off eating the larger breakfast and the smaller dinner. And this is for a lot of different reasons, including insulin sensitivity throughout the day. So it does alter throughout the day. Just energy expenditure throughout the day. If eating a bigger breakfast may increase your energy expenditure throughout the day, both at rest and, just you feel like you have a little bit more energy, so you do a little bit more exercise. And also eating a large meal before bed may alter your ability to get and stay in really deep sleep. So it does appear that a larger protein breakfast and a larger calorie breakfast is more beneficial for both fat loss and muscle gain.
Yeah, I've looked into the ongoing debate. It's like the quantum, light crowd uh, versus the food crowd. And I'm like, why can't it be both? But that's besides my point. They argue about what's a stronger stimulus, light or food. And some will, to set your circadian rhythm, like what you were just talking about, eating the bigger meal at the start of the day. And I've heard that food is a way stronger stimulus to set our circadian rhythm than light is.
Yeah, honestly, I wish there were really like clear defined numbers on this. And I think anyone telling you that they could give you the exact answer may just be a little bit too confident in their answer. I couldn't tell you. I do agree with you. Why not both? I think both are super important. You know, you do notice that if you're not outside as much, you may not sleep as well. Your mood is probably a little bit lower. So I think light is extremely important. I haven't looked too much into light and frequencies and things like that. So the quantum realm, I haven't gotten as much into it as I probably should have. A lot of it, as I probably told you a little earlier, was it just doesn't interest me as much as, kind of the things we're talking about today. But I do think it's important. So I've watched a few Jack Cruz videos and things like that. So he's an interesting and compelling guy.
Yeah.
But I do think that both are important. And, um, you know, I couldn't tell you which one is more important.
Yeah, I like the you have a lot of awesome reels, and I'll share your page at the end of the show. But you made one about the sunglasses myth, and we don't have to get too deep into it, but I just wanted to bring it up. That was, I think, yeah, that is my favorite reel you've ever made, or little informative video. And you're not dancing or singing on video. It's just you, usually with a study behind you, and you're kind of breaking down these ideas. And it's one that I like, that was my religion for years, essentially, was like sunglasses are bad, like never ever wear sunglasses. And I find myself still trained to not wear them. Like last summer, risking hitting someone on the road. I mean, I never did or never got close, but driving a car and you're driving into the sun, obviously you should wear some sunglasses. It's like but in relation to circadian rhythm, I think that was your video where you were talking about um, blocking light from your eyes. It's not the end of the world, right?
So I think the sunglasses reel was someone saying that if you wear sunglasses, you'll inhibit your ability to tan.
Right. Yeah.
So that was an idea I've only found one person who's considered like a scientific researcher who said something about that, but she never provided any evidence or data anywhere. And it was the idea that if you're wearing sunglasses, this will make you more likely to sunburn, but not tan. And if we look at the kind of the physiology of tanning occurs inside of the skin cells. So it's almost under zero regulation of the brain. There may be a very, very tiny regulation from the brain that we don't yet know about or fully understand. But 99, I would say 99% of the regulation of tanning occurs inside of the skin. So, you have essentially a cellular response that increases the production of melanin inside of melanocytes. And the melanocytes are inside of your skin. So I haven't found anything to tell me that, if you wear sunglasses, you won't be able to tan. I would say, yeah, I think getting light inside of your eyes. So there are studies indicating that, if you're viewing light through a window or a windshield, it's not as good as if you're viewing it through, nothing and just not staring directly into the sun, because that's probably even worse. But, being outside and exposing your eyes to, the light spectrum outdoors. So I would say when you can take off your sunglasses, you can do it. But putting on sunglasses probably isn't going to wreck your entire circadian rhythm, because there's so many inputs towards our circadian pattern throughout the day that, wearing sunglasses for an hour probably isn't going to do very much for you. And for some people, let's say you're wearing these sunglasses and it's like mid-afternoon. This may actually help you kind of down-regulate for sleep later that night, just by blocking a little bit more blue light. So I think there's an impact of circadian rhythm. We don't yet, I would say we can't yet fully tell you exactly what it is. No one can. But I think it's like a good, better, best scenario. So I would rather someone not crash their car and wear sunglasses than, get this a little bit more blue light in their eyes during the day, if that makes any sense.
I think I've told the story on the show before, but my brother is a big heavy metal fan. He's taken me to a bunch of concerts. I mean, Rammstein, Slayer, I mean, crazy concerts. And we went to a Metallica concert. And I remember this guy was wearing sunglasses for hours. And as soon as the sun set and the stage lights came on, he took off the sunglasses. And I'm like, I was looking at that guy and I was kind of judging him. And I was like, that guy's reversing his circadian rhythm. But if he was a night shift worker studying Ryder's book on melatonin, he could have been, I mean, he probably wasn't a night shift worker, but if he was, that was actually a smart thing to do because he was probably reversing his rhythm, right?
Yeah, I mean, he probably wanted to stay up and, party all night long. And, he didn't want to be getting a little bit tired, while he was trying to perform on stage. So there is, I do think that light is important for regulating the circadian rhythm. And, you can do a lot, like you can manipulate a lot through just altering your light environment to help alter your circadian rhythm, even independent of what's going on outside. So in someone that is working night shifts, trying to almost artificially expose their eyes to blue light when they want to be awake. And even if the sun is rising, trying to ensure that they're not exposing their eyes to blue light when they're about to go to sleep, regardless of what the sun is doing outside, that's probably going to be a beneficial thing. So I think you can use light to make yourself more or less attentive. So, if he really wanted to make sure that he was, on, like he was ready for that concert really late at night, trying to get as much light into his eyes would probably be a beneficial thing. And,
Yeah.
For some people in the morning, if you wake up while the sun's still down, even blue light from your phone can help increase your attentiveness as much as you would want blue light from the sun. If you don't have access to that, getting some other form of blue light in your eyes is better than not getting any blue light in your eyes, even though it's coming from your phone.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a little meter that I could take outside, I forget what it's called, spectrometer, and it shows the different wavelengths and the graph. And it's amazing. Even in winter, there's still all the colors. It's just that it's way less intense. So the strength of it is way less. But yeah, the relationship between light and insulin and blood sugar, it's really intimate, right? I mean, because you look at these night shift workers. And my first job was overnight stalker, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. at PetSmart. It was like unloading 20 pallets. And I remember just feeling horrible. And I think a lot of that is because of just you're trying to flip or diurnal. And so you're trying to convert to a nocturnal creature. And that just doesn't, I mean, it could work. It just, you have to know what you're doing. Most people don't that are working night shift. And I think that's why they have increased risk of cancer and all these diseases, right?
Yeah, I think there's probably there's probably a lot of different reasons that go into it. And some people, I hear a lot of people say this causes cancer or this is what caused cancer. And it's like, there's so many factors that go into the cancer or diseases. There's just so many that we can't pinpoint it on one thing, like a lot of it's genetics and things like that. So it's like trying to find this one thing like I've heard a lot of videos, people saying that, famous rock stars have died because they're always wearing sunglasses. And the reason that they passed away early was because of the sunglasses. It's like there are so many things with their lifestyle, probably drugs, alcohol, things like that, that probably, caused or contributed to what happened that, we can't just blame it on the sunglasses. So I think, the increased risk of cancer for night shift workers may be due to a lot of things. So people that are subject to night shift, maybe someone that's, doesn't have as much money. So they're forced almost to work night shifts for a little bit of extra money, or they're forced to work night shifts because, maybe they're doing something during the day too. And at that point, they're just not getting any sleep rather than, the wrong timing. So I think there's a lot of things that contribute to it. But I mean, yeah, I think humans do best when they're in their normal circadian pattern of, viewing the sun and things like that, just because it's the way that we've adapted. But I think
Mm-hmm.
there are things you can do to kind of artificially mimic, normal daylight cycles, even if you are working night shifts.
Yeah, it's a great point that you make. I think a lot of these, not your reels, but other reels and sensationalist videos that are made, it is like, did you know that this causes this? And it would be nice if they kind of made the caveat that this is one major contributor instead of this is it, because that's often how it's framed.
Yeah, and I've made a video on it once. So I think anything you consume, anything you do in in life will have both positives and negatives. So I made a video on it one time. I was like, here's the foods that you should never eat. And I essentially listed every single food on the planet. And you probably shouldn't breathe either because there's a lot of chemicals in the environment. And essentially you can find something wrong with everything. You know, there are people who tell you they're finding things wrong with meat, with vegetables, with fruit, with anything that you could consume, with your water. So it is true that pretty much everything that you do or consume will have some drawbacks to it. Nothing is perfect. But if you actually look at the benefits and the drawbacks and make a decision, you know, if it maybe there are some drawbacks to it, but it contributes to a positive life, there may be some benefits to that, you know. And, you know, you look at the people that live to 120 who smoked every day or drank every day. You know, maybe this drinking was coming with family and that helped, you know, increase their lifespan and just health span because they were happier. So there's a lot of drawbacks to essentially everything. But if you look at it in the bigger picture, you can kind of ascertain what you may want to actually avoid and what you probably don't have to worry about too much. I would say if you, and at one point, like I was this very impressionable kid and like I was scared of everything. You know, I didn't want to eat anything because there was something wrong with everything. And at that point, you know, it becomes, you're not focused on health anymore. You're just kind of, it's like a paralysis by analysis. So I think if you see a lot of those reels online of people saying, don't eat this because of this, you can almost immediately dismiss that. Or at that point, just do your own research and see, you know, what the majority of the evidence says. You know, let's say, you know, there might be something wrong with the fish that you consume, but in populations that are consuming a lot more fish, do they have issues with, you know, whatever contaminant is inside of fish? Like they did a study, if you increase your fruit and vegetable intake, you'd probably prevent about 20,000 cancer cases. But because of the increased pesticide consumption, you may actually increase about 10 cases of cancer. So you'd only be saving about 19,990 people, but you'd be sacrificing about 10 to an increased pesticide consumption. So if you kind of look at it like that, I think it broadens your eyes to a lot more, not being scared of everything, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I've kind of stepped back from social media because it's just kind of exhausting to see the clickbait titles. And I see it on YouTube too, you know, big names I'm subscribed to. And a lot of it is just to get attention and to get views and clicks. And it's often like a fear angle. Like, did you know like this that you've been consuming has been doing this to your body? And, you know, I got out of the iron overload thing last year because I realized it was doing more harm than good to people. And there's just so many things like that where I don't know if social media is a net positive anymore and people are just more confused than ever. I mean, I don't want to put people in the victim seat because we always have a choice. And I think a lot of people are just over consuming information and they, you know, still get messages. That's the most common message. It's like, I'm so confused. You know, you say this and another person says this, or you used to say this and now you're saying this, and it's so contradictory. I'm like, can you think for yourself? Is that is that possible? You know, instead of being told what to do.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like I would say when we were talking about insulin resistance, one thing I said is that, you know, saturated fat is more detrimental to insulin sensitivity than any other type of fatty acid. And some people are going to look at that and say, you know, now I can't ever eat saturated fat again. And that's why immediately when I said it, I want to caveat with the fact that this may not necessarily be a bad thing. And in the grand scheme of things, it's probably negligible. And if you're consuming a food that has saturated fat in it, and this food is keeping you satiated, providing you with micronutrients, and allowing you to maintain a healthy body weight, such as, you know, eggs or steak or something like that, and this food is giving you micronutrients and again, allowing you to maintain health in the grand scheme of things, even if it does have a detrimental effect to insulin sensitivity acutely, in the grand scheme of things, it probably isn't a bad thing. And in the most cases, everything works. So you could, like I said, with the type 1 diabetics or even type 2 diabetics, it can be reversed on a fruitarian diet or a carnivore diet. So if you find something that you enjoy, everyone is going to tell you why it's wrong. But if it's working for you, it doesn't really matter why it's wrong in almost every case. You know, in certain scenarios, like let's say you were doing, you know, a completely vegan diet, but you were missing out on a lot of micronutrients. So you weren't supplementing with B12, you weren't consuming a lot of protein. That might get you into danger, despite seeing good results in the beginning. But for most people, if you're taking a sensible approach to things, like eating a little bit of fruits and vegetables, eating a little bit of animal products, being an omnivore instead of being, polarized to one side, you know, you could probably find reasons why fruits are going to be detrimental and why meat would be detrimental. But in the grand scheme of things, I think if you find something that works, for most people, the extreme nuances probably isn't something you'd want to worry about.
Yeah, unless you're into this like us and want to learn all the nuances, but the person that this isn't their profession or their career or whatever, their main focus, they probably don't need to know the nuances. But I got a lot of messages like, oh, go ahead.
I would say that the stress and inflammation that you would cause or that you're causing yourself by being scared of eating every food is probably worse than just consuming the food. Just because, like when you're so obsessed with things, oftentimes it becomes pathological. And then at some point it's like, everything you do, you'll second guess. And that probably is worse than, just doing it in the first place sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, we started this podcast with you talking about your, listening to podcasts for 8-9 hours a day. And I did the same thing. And as long as it's, making you happy and excited and you're really interested in it, and it's not stressing you out, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think it's way better than listening to music. Well, depends. I guess that music is therapeutic in different ways, but if you have a health issue, I think it's better than music to listen to podcasts because you're going to find the solution eventually listening to enough people, not on mainstream podcasts, but podcasts like mine, where you're hearing all these different viewpoints. And I've had shows on blood sugar with different people, and most of what you said was not said in my other shows. And it's great because now people can make these connections and see see some solutions with maybe personal issues or issues with their family or loved ones. So this has been awesome. Appreciate it, Cal.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I would say to kind of close things off, I think a lot of people hyper focus on macronutrients when it comes to insulin sensitivity, whereas I think the most important factors are going to be, exercising, so mobilizing fatty acids and oxidizing them, and then maintaining a healthy body weight. Because the smaller your fat cells, the more safer you are able to store any excess calories that you consume. But the larger they already are, the less capacity you have to store them, and the more likely you are to develop some of the ramifications of excessive consumption of pretty much any macronutrient. So I think just maintaining a healthy body weight and a healthy body composition and a healthy lifestyle. So, if you have a tooth infection, go get that sorted out. And in the grand scheme of things, that's probably the big things that you should be worried about. And then you can look into the other stuff if you have the time and the energy for it. But most people don't. They've got other stuff going on. So get the big rocks out of control and are under control. And once you've gotten those under control, that's when you can start picking up the pebbles.
It's a great takeaway. And we could have a whole nother show on how to get to a healthy body weight. And there's entire, multi-million or billion-dollar industry with fat loss shakes and multi-level marketing companies and stuff. As you said, it's not just one thing. And so with weight loss, there's going to be so many things that people can try. So there's not going to be one solution for everyone, because I think that's what's often marketed, and that's not the case. So awesome, Calvin. So where can people find you right now?
Yeah, so I have a few different locations. Essentially, if you look my name up on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, you can find all my videos. I also have a website where you can, sign up for coaching if you wanted to, or you can just DM me and, ask about coaching or booking just one-on-one calls that we can talk. It might be a little bit cheaper, less of an investment. So I think my Instagram is Calvin_Scheller. I would say just look up my name on TikTok and YouTube, because I couldn't even tell you the exact the exact tags for everything. And the only other thing I could say is that, if you really need anything from me, just send me a DM and then we can discuss about, I can help you. Even if you have financial issues, I can help you for free, things like that. So just reach out to me. I'm do my best to respond to everyone. And then if you want to read a little bit more about things that I've written about, I have a few blogs on my website, and I have one all about insulin if you want to read a little bit about that. So just reach out to me, send me a DM, something like that.
Awesome. And what's your website, Calvin?
I believe it's called Calvin's Coaching. com, and then there's also a link to it in my Instagram and pretty much in the description of all of my YouTube videos.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. Is it Calvin Coaching International? Maybe it's a different. I'll have you send it and I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, this was so much fun, Calvin. I appreciate it. And yeah, I highly recommend you guys go and check out his videos. And side note, thanks for going into the trenches on TikTok. I think those people need a lot of help on many levels.
Thank you so much for having me on again. Like, I've been listening to your podcast for a while, so I was ecstatic when you reached out to me, man.
Yeah, I'm impressed by your brain. You're a lot. Your brain's working a lot better than mine was at that age. So thanks so much, and stick around as we close out the show.
Got it.
Well, that was a ton of information. Hope you guys got something out of that and pick some good stuff that you can take action on. I'm really impressed at Calvin's brain at 18 years old. I definitely wasn't on that level. I started doing what he was doing probably at the age of 22, but he's a testament to it's never too early to start researching, and it's definitely never too late. And most importantly, actually applying the information, because as I said at the start, I see all of these alternative health podcasts and they're all kind of parroting the same thing. And the carnivore diet's still going strong. These imbalanced perspectives of demonizing foods and macronutrients. And every time I look at my feed on social media or YouTube or whatever, I always see these fear campaigns, why you shouldn't eat this, why you shouldn't take this supplement. And it really spins people into a frenzy of confusion where they just become paralyzed. So hopefully shows like this help to alleviate a lot of that fear and empower you with more of a balanced approach. I like that he brought up vitamin C or ascorbic acid, vitamin E, and magnesium as being really important for insulin sensitivity, even in lieu of weight loss. So if someone's still overweight and they consume those, they'll still see a benefit. That really goes to show the power of nutritional supplements, that these aren't just urinated out, but they're having really incredible effects. I'll put the links below to where you can check out Calvin's material. As he mentioned, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and then his website, calvinscoaching.com, if you'd like to work with him. Once again, really impressed with his brain. He's definitely the youngest guest I've ever had on the show, but it doesn't mean that his soul is young. It's just his body. To me, it really comes down to inspiration to create really healthy babies and children with better functioning brains, because I believe we truly have been severely handicapped. My website is matt-blackburn.com. You could read about my CLF protocol. Speaking of handicaps, these are calcification, lipofuscin, and fibrosis, three things that accumulate in the body over time, and I think are intimately tied with the process that we call aging. So I share solutions for those there on that website. And then if you click on shop, you can see all of my recommended products. And these are best used in conjunction with supplements. On that page, I have various body working tools, water filtration, things that you could use in your home to improve the environment as far as lighting, dirty electricity filters. If you fly in planes a lot, I have exogenous ketone shots on there, which I love to take when flying. Molecular hydrogen tablets from Vital Reaction. You drop those in water on the flight. I do that every time I fly. And those really help reduce oxidative stress while traveling. And then my brand is Mitolife. You can find that at mitolife.co. Right now, we're having a ton of sales. There are surplus sales on various products. One called Encephalon, which is a super brain booster. It's a combination of a microalgae extract that's rich in fucoxanthin, combined with phosphatidylserine from sunflower, not soy, and ginkgo biloba extract. I take 4 capsules every night, and the phosphatidylserine and the ginkgo biloba have been shown in clinical trials to lower cortisol. So I find that combined with melatonin at night, those really prime me for a great night of sleep. Lowering cortisol, raising melatonin. It's a really great feeling to wind down. Jellyfish collagen is also on sale. That's another supplement that I take before bed because the amino acids in there are precursors to neurotransmitters, calming neurotransmitters. And it's also rich in multiple minerals, including potassium, sodium, chloride, copper, calcium, magnesium, manganese, zinc, iron, sulfur, silicon, all of which help enzymes to function. And jellyfish collagen is actually a complete protein. It has all essential and, quote, non-essential amino acids. And then also on sale is the elk velvet antler. And this is a supplement I often recommend if people have dogs that have aching joints or have trouble walking. A 1-2 punch of elk velvet and shilajit alone, I've seen pretty much bring dogs back to life. But whether you're a dog or a human, the effects are the same. Elk velvet antler contains all essential amino acids, has collagen, chondroitin sulfate, hyaluronic acid. A lot of the isolated ingredients that you'll see in like joint formulas, this is similar to that, but you're also getting calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, iron, calcium, silica, even manganese, really trace minerals that work synergistically with everything to give a pretty incredible effect, not only on joints, but helping with hormonal balance and skin and collagen production and just regeneration after injury. And then there's Dairy Absorb. That's a lactase enzyme. If you or someone you know is having issues digesting dairy, you just pop 1 capsule of that and you could still get all of the benefits of consuming high quality dairy without the bloating and gas. And of course, you could overdo it. I found for me, over a long period of time experimenting with dairy, that I really can't go over 12 ounces at a time. If I do, that just overloads my system. But for me, it's about drinking small amounts. And at the moment, I'm pretty much just consuming, say, 12 to 16 ounces a day of raw A2 Guernsey milk. Then the last supplement on sale is Digest It All. It's actually half off right now. It's digestive enzymes. These are really underrated, especially if someone's dealing with chronic gas and bloating. Just taking one of these with every meal really helps. It's helped me over the years when I got into enzymes back in 2010. I was actually taking handfuls of enzymes. I found with this one, I just need one and I get the same effect. So last thing, I have an Academy on YouTube. It's a private membership, $15 a month. You get 2 private videos every month of my latest research, experiments, revelations, and then a live Q&A the last day of every month. So that is all. I'll see you guys next Friday. Stay supercharged.